Welcome. Take a moment now to breathe deeply, slowly. Inhale, filling your lungs with the calm, quiet air around you. And as you exhale, let the weight of your day slowly slip away. Let the feeling of timelessness wash over you. You are not rushing here. The evening stretches ahead, and with it, an unfolding story from centuries ago, waiting to be discovered. Beneath the marble and opulence, beneath the glory of Rome, lies a world much grimmer one, where survival is a constant, a brutal battle fought day after day. The stones are cold, the walls thick and unyielding. There is no marble here, no luxury. On one side, there is the luxury of the ruling elite, the grandeur of the Colosseum, the spectacle of blood and sport. On the other, the oppressive, lifeless existence of those whose only purpose is to entertain gladiators who train and fight for their lives, or for the mere hope of freedom. But as humans whose lives were filled with challenges, not unlike our own, but also of their resilience, their ability to endure, and their unspoken desire for something more than what fate had assigned them. Through their stories, we may find a deeper understanding of the human spirit, of how we all, at times, face our own arenas, our own struggles. We will explore the triumphs and tragedies that shaped the lives of those who fought for their lives in the Roman arenas. But we will also draw out the lessons their stories can offer us today. The life of a gladiator was undoubtedly brutal, but it was also a life defined by an extraordinary sense of perseverance. It was a life that, despite the bloodshed and suffering, carried with it the quiet courage of those who, against all odds, refused to surrender. They fought day after day, against overwhelming odds. Their battles were not just with each other, but with the very reality of their existence. As we move through the gladiators' world, we invite you to reflect on the depths of their lives, and in doing so, perhaps uncover something profound about your own. For, while we are far removed from their time, the essence of their struggle, tired, full of conflict, but undeniably resilient, is something that transcends history. They lived in a world where death and glory were often inseparable, where each fight could be their last, and yet, through it all, they clung to something more than mere survival. They clung to hope for freedom, for victory, and sometimes, for a fleeting moment of fame. Instead, there are the clanging sounds of swords being sharpened, the creak of old leather. We are not here merely to observe history from a distance. We are here to feel it, to live it, in a way that is not just factual but immersive. We will travel with these warriors through their harsh daily routines, through the dusty training grounds, and into the chaos of the arena. Their lives, gritty, demanding, often hopeless, were marked by a constant struggle to survive. But amid this struggle, there were fleeting moments of triumph, a fragile taste of freedom, and an unyielding will to endure. And the murmurs of men, slaves, prisoners of war, criminals who have been trained to fight, to kill, or to die in the name of entertainment. You feel the weight of their world, heavy and uncertain, as you move deeper into this dark, confined space. The cold stone beneath your feet sends a chill up your spine, and the clinking sound of armor settling into place fills the air with a constant reminder of what awaits. The noise of the city fades as you take a step back, slipping through the shadows toward the barracks, where the gladiators prepare for the contests that will define their existence. All you need to do is relax and let the story come to you, gently, like the slow passage of time itself. Imagine yourself leaving behind the noise and rush of the modern world, stepping into a time far removed above you. The sun is beginning its descent, casting a soft golden hue over the massive stone structure, the largest amphitheater ever built. Towering arches rise up on all sides, while the faint scent of perfume and roasted meats drifts from the market stalls that line the streets. The Colosseum is alive with the sounds of chariots, wheels rolling over the cobblestones, their sharp rhythm like the heartbeat of the city itself. As the day moves toward evening, the air is thick with anticipation, the air charged with the energy of the crowd gathering within. A place where the pulse of life beats with the rhythm of ancient routines and the fading light of day casts long shadows over the stone streets. Visualize the soft hum of a distant crowd. It's not a chaotic clamor, but rather a gentle, consistent murmur, as if the voices of thousands are carried on the evening breeze, close enough to be heard, but still distant and muted. The faint sound of leather straps tightening, the clink of metal on metal, the subtle rustling of old scrolls being turned over, their edges softly brushing against each other, all blend together, creating a tapestry of soothing sounds that wrap around you like a blanket. There's a flicker of torchlight ahead, the soft glow illuminating the cold, polished stone beneath your feet. The air is warm, yet carries the sharp scent of burning wood and wax from nearby lamps, creating a cozy, almost nostalgic atmosphere. As you drift deeper into this scene, let the rhythm of your breathing match the slow, deliberate pace of ancient life. Now, imagine you are standing at the grand entrance to the Colosseum. Beyond the grandeur, though, there is another reality to this city, a contrast as sharp as the blades that would soon gleam under the arena's harsh light. The barracks, unlike the grand amphitheater, are not filled with the vibrancy of life, but with a quieter, more oppressive energy. You pause to take it all in, letting the contrasting realities of ancient Rome settle in your mind. As we step into the world of these gladiators, let us do so with more than just curiosity. As we journey through the world of the gladiators, take a moment to connect with them not just as figures from a distant past. This journey is an exploration not only of the harshness of their lives in the coming hours. We will reflect on their sacrifices, their hardships, and their quiet strength. This is not merely a recounting of battles, but a meditation on survival, freedom, and the price of glory. Step into the stillness of the gladiator barracks, the space where the passage of time is measured not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the toll of exhaustion on every muscle and the relentless weight of survival. You can feel the coolness of the stone floor seeping up through your sandals, a chill that gnaws at your bones. Some are already asleep, their shallow breaths punctuating the silence. It reminds you that this is your life, now your reality. The sound of the blades being honed will be a familiar companion, as much a part of your world as the endless training drills and the bone-deep fatigue that you carry with you every day. Others shift restlessly, lost in their own thoughts, or perhaps the dreams of a life long since past, a life before the chains of servitude and combat bound them to this brutal existence. Almost inaudible sounds of the barracks door, soft clink of iron against leather as weapons are adjusted, the rasp of breath from men too exhausted to speak. The cold stone beneath you is unforgiving, as hard as the life you now lead. Your mind, always alert, begins to wander through the memories of a life before the arena life that now feels like a distant dream. Perhaps you think of family, of a time when you walked freely through the streets of Rome, before the chains of slavery and combat bound you to this unforgiving fate. In your chest, there is still the faintest hope that one day, perhaps, you will be free, that the fight will end with the rudies, a wooden sword that symbolizes your release. The constant anticipation of the next battle, the uncertainty of each fight, the sense of being no more than a piece of meat in the hands of your masters. These thoughts swirl in your mind. It is a life defined by the tension between hope and despair, a fragile dance between survival and death. Even as the barracks settle into quiet, there is no peace, only the knowledge that tomorrow's training will begin again. And with it, the constant question, will today be the day you finally fall? It is a dream that lives faint and distant, but one that you cannot fully let go of. Yet, for many gladiators, this hope is crushed under the weight of reality. The rudies is as distant as the life you once had, and so, you push it aside, turning instead to the present, turning to the battle ahead. There is no other choice but to fight. Or perhaps you'd think of the small moments of joy that have long since been stolen from you, the taste of fresh bread, the sound of laughter echoing in a market square, the warmth of a fire crackling in a hearth. These fleeting memories sting, sharp and bitter, because they are out of reach. They are a reminder of what you have lost. Sleep does not come. You shift in the straw, the rough fibers scraping against your skin, your body too weary to find true comfort. Every breath you take seems to be a reminder of the fight ahead, of the unrelenting training, of the constant preparation for combat. There is no end to the cycle. Each day brings with it the same rhythm of exhaustion. The drills, the weapons, the shields, the swords, the constant reminder that every moment of peace, every breath of air, is fleeting. The silence of the night is broken only by the occasional stir of your fellow gladiators. One man shifts in his bed, the soft rustle of straw filling the air, the quiet groan of a body too weary to rest, echoes in the room. Some men are deep in slumber, their bodies still, their faces relaxed. Yet there is a tension in the air, an unspoken awareness that, while the night may bring a momentary respite, the inevitable return to training is always near. The barracks are a place where time seems to stretch endlessly, where the rhythm of each day blends into the next, all while the world outside carries on as if unaware of the suffering contained within these walls. The heat of the day, trapped within the stone walls, still clings to the air, but it is now tempered by the chill of the evening, which creeps into the cracks and corners of the barracks. There is no warmth here, no comfort. The air bites at your exposed skin, the cold seeping into your bones. even as the last traces of heat from the day's training linger on your muscles. But even in sleep, there is no real escape. Their bodies are too tense, too aware of the weight of the coming days. Sweat clings to your skin, sticky and salty, a reminder of the long hours spent training with sword and shield. Your hands are stiff, the calluses on your palms rough and thick, worn down from gripping the hilt of the practice sword. The faint sting of old wounds, still healing but never fully gone, tingles beneath the surface of your skin. The low, rhythmic sound of men breathing is punctuated by the quiet scraping of metal on stone, the sound of the sword being sharpened. Each stroke like the passing of a clock, relentless and constant. The muffled noise from the outside world shouts, the occasional clash of chariot wheels on cobblestone. The far-off murmur of the city seems so far removed from this place, as if it exists in a different world entirely. You are removed from the pleasures of the Roman elite, the indulgences of food and luxury. Instead, you live in a world defined by blood and sand, where every moment of your life is measured by your next battle, your next drill, your next attempt to survive. The mats you sleep on are nothing more than thin, rough cloth filled with coarse straw, offering no real protection against the hardness of the floor beneath. Your body, aching from hours of grueling training, settles into the straw with a low, tired groan. The straw rustles as you shift, the sound faint but sharp in the otherwise stillness of the night. There is no warmth, here no blankets, no cushions, only the feel of the coarse fibers digging into your skin as you lie, attempting to sleep but unable to fully rest. The air is thick with the scent of sweat, dust, and the acrid tamps of Iona, constant reminder of the sharp biting metal that will soon find its way into battle. Flickering torchlight casts, long, unsteady shadows that seem to stretch across the cold, uneven stone walls, as if trying to escape the oppressive weight of the place. The dim light, yellow and faint, barely touches the damp surfaces, leaving much of the room veiled in gloom. The barracks are cramped, sparse, with no attempt at comfort or warmth. The other gladiators are scattered around you, their bodies equally tired, their faces drawn and gaunt from days of exhausting practice and the ever-present threat of the arena. The sharpness of that noise, the scrape of the wet stone against the blade, is oddly comforting in its predictability. As the night deepens, the faint hum of the world outside grows distant, replaced by the quiet. You can feel the weight of your body as you lie there, the ache of overworked muscles and joints pressing into the thin straw beneath you. The barracks, though filled with the sounds of men, feels deeply isolated. The cold of the night creeps under your skin, seeping into your bones, and you find yourself huddling deeper into the thin cloth that offers no real warmth. As the night wears on, you find your thoughts drifting, despite your exhaustion. And yet, there is no time to dwell on these thoughts. But amid this exhaustion, there is something else, something quieter, more persistent, a flicker of hope. It is small, fragile, but it survives. The emotional toll is heavier than the physical burden. The sound of the trainer's whip cracks through the air, a sharp, commanding snap that punctuates the morning silence. It is the signal to beginning. The gladiators, their muscles stiff from the hours of sleep that never seem restful, shuffle into position on the gritty, sand-dusted ground of the training yard. For the Mamillo, a heavily armored gladiator with a large rectangular shield, the weight of the sword is both a burden and a lifeline. The short gladiator's blade, polished and gleaming, fits perfectly into the gladiator's hand. Its weight and intimate presence. The training swords, made from rough-hewn wood, are blunt but still carry the weight of truth in each swing. They do not hesitate, they cannot afford to. Like clockwork, the warriors swing their swords in unison, their arms moving with the precision of well-oiled machinery. Some fight for the faint hope of freedom, the rudies, the promise that one day, their survival may be rewarded with their release. Others are driven by the sheer need to survive another day, to avoid the brutality of the arena and live long enough to see another sunrise. It is not just physical endurance they must summon, but mental fortitude. Each day, they must push themselves past the limits of pain, past the whispering voice in their minds that urges them to give in, to stop. Like clockwork, they block, they parry, they strike. And yet, despite the monotony, there is an unspoken bond between these men. They train together, fight together, and suffer together. Their bodies are becoming one, their movements a seamless extension of each other. The swords, the shields, the tridents, the nets, they are no longer just weapons. They are extensions of themselves, tools that give them the power to survive, to endure, to fight another day. But they don't. They can't. Their lives are defined by the same pattern: train, fight, rest, repeat. They are trapped in this cycle, but within it, they find their strength. It is the repetition, the endless, exhausting routine that keeps them grounded, that keeps them alive. For the gladiators, survival is not just about fighting with weapons. It is about enduring the unrelenting rhythm of their lives, the constant cycle of repetition that defines their very existence. The rhythm is almost hypnotic: the repetitive swing, the block, the parry, the thrust, step, strike, retreat, repeat. It is a constant struggle against despair, against the knowledge that no matter how much they train, how hard they fight, they may still be nothing more than entertainment for the man. The crowd may cheer, but the gladiator knows that when the roar fades, he returns to his cold mat, to the weight of his armor, to the unyielding brutality of his masters. The body grows familiar with each motion, and soon, it becomes second nature. It is a thin, fragile thread, but it is enough to keep them moving forward. And so, they push themselves through the drills, day in and day out, their bodies slowly becoming harder, more resilient, more accustomed to the pain. They train not just with their bodies, but with their minds, forcing themselves to imagine, to believe that one day, they will be free, that their suffering will not be in vain. Their muscles, once stiff and uncoordinated, now move with fluidity, the motion of the blade and the body becoming one in the harsh, unyielding heat of the training yard. Every movement, every swing of the sword, every thrust of the trident, is an act of survival, repeated over and over again. There is little time to rest or reflect. Each day is a carbon copy of the last, each action, a mirror of the one that came before. The very nature of this repetition becomes a metaphor for the gladiator's existence. A cycle of struggle and hope, pain and perseverance, with no clear end in sight. There is no room for error. Every motion must be precise, every strike calculated. They are wielded like real blades, and each strike, whether it lands or is blocked, sends a jolt through the gladiator's body. The clink of the training swords hitting shield, the thud as they crash into the armor, sends a ripple of tension through the air. These sounds, sharp and precise, are the soundtrack of the gladiator's life. It is a life of repetition, each movement performed as though on a loop, a never-ending cycle that only halts when the call for rest comes, and even then, it is brief. The hilt presses into the palm, and the grip is firm, roughened by calluses from countless swings. Each time the sword is drawn, it's an act of preparation, not for just a fight, but for a life spent swinging steel and blocking blows. They are often former fighters themselves, men who have been broken by the same brutal system they now impose on the others. The trainers are not kind. There is no space for kindness in this world. Their commands are barked with an almost animalistic authority. A flick of the whip is enough to keep the gladiators in line, pushing them past the point of exhaustion and into the realm of fear. Each time a gladiator stumbles, a trainer's voice rings out a curse, in order to stand up, to try again. There is no encouragement here, only a demand for improvement. The trainers are driven by a single purpose: to mold these men into weapons, to sharpen them until they are as deadly as the steel they wield. Compassion does not factor into their methods. The rhythmic swoosh of the blade cutting through the air becomes as familiar as breathing, as if it is simply the natural sound of existence. It's a place that has become both a prison and a proving ground, a stark reminder of the harsh fate that awaits them outside the gates of the barracks. The sun beats down from above, and the heat of the day quickly settles in, warming the stone underfoot and causing the sweat on their bodies to bead up, only to be wiped away by the rhythmic motion of constant drills. The warriors stand in rows, their faces taut with concentration, their eyes burning with a mix of determination and resignation. The thick leather of their sandals slaps against the ground as they take their positions. There is no chatter, no idle conversation. The air is filled only with the sounds of commands, barked by the trainers, each word sharp and direct, leaving no room for hesitation. His weaponry is a delicate balance of agility and precision. The trident, with its 3 sharp, spear-like points, feels almost weightless in his hands at first, but over time, it becomes an extension of his very being. The smoothness of the shaft against his palm, the sharpness of the prongs that threaten to pierce the air with every calculated thrust. This is his life now. The net, heavy and cumbersome at first, requires skill to throw with perfect accuracy. The feeling of the coarse rope slipping through his fingers, the way the net catches the light as it flies through the air, it is an elegant dance, the balance between strength and grace, that will one day be tested in the arena. The battle for survival starts here, in this harsh arena of sweat and blood. The weapons they wield are not just tools, they are extensions of their very selves. For the faster gladiator who faces the opponent with only a net and a trident, the practice is equally demanding, but with a different focus. As the gladiators pair off, the clang of wood against wood reverberates through the yard. The gladiators' movements are practiced to perfection, honed over weeks, months, and years. The trainers stand in the background, their eyes sharp and cold, observing the gladiators with detached scrutiny. For the gladiators themselves, there is a quiet internal struggle. What drives them to endure this relentless training? The psychological toll of this life is immense. The hope for freedom, though a distant dream, clings to them like a thread. The routine of training is, in many ways, the epitome of a gladiator's life. Like clockwork, the warriors swing their swords, their bodies moving with a mechanical precision born from necessity. The repetition is not just physical, it seeps into the gladiators' minds, shaping the very fabric of their existence. Every day a gladiator wakes, the reality of his existence weighs heavily upon him. The threat of death hangs in the air, palpable and suffocating, as constant as the rhythm of his own heartbeat. Yet, this awareness doesn't paralyze him. It fuels his drive to continue, to fight harder, to endure longer. It is not just the physical threat of being struck down by an opponent, but the psychological toll of knowing that death may come not in a moment of glory, but in the most mundane of ways. An unexpected lunge, a faltering step, or the cruel misjudgment of a throw. While it may offer a glimmer of light in the otherwise brutal darkness of their lives, it often seems impossible to attain. Gladiators are keenly aware that this fragile hope can be crushed just as quickly as it appears. The fight for freedom is not just physical, it is political. The decision to grant a rudis may depend more on the whims of the emperor or the game's organizers than on their actual worth or skill as warriors. They may wonder who they were before their lives were consumed by this cruel world of combat. The camaraderie that forms among the gladiators is built on a shared understanding of this unspoken rule. But it is not just the fresh injuries that are the most significant, it is the cumulative damage. The joints become stiff with each fight, the muscles strained beyond their natural limits. But these marks do not always tell the full story. The internal scars, the ones hidden deep within the soul, are often the most profound. For gladiators, each scar represents more than just an injury. It is a permanent reminder of their place in the world, their struggle for survival, and the lives they have lived and lost. A gladiator's body grows heavy over time, weighed down not just by the armor, but by the pain that lingers long after the arena falls silent. The ever-present threat of death, the constant hope, mingled with the crushing reality of servitude. The camaraderie born of shared suffering, all of this takes its toll on the body and the mind. The scars, both visible and invisible, are permanent reminders of a life lived on the edge of survival. But even in the face of such overwhelming odds, there is a quiet strength, a resilience that drives them forward, day after day. For a gladiator, life is not just about surviving the next battle, it's about enduring the weight of existence itself, and the hope that, one day, they might finally be free. The scars, both physical and emotional, become part of their identity. They are the silent witnesses of a life lived in service of blood and glory. They do not talk about it often, but they all know each man is expendable, and the future is uncertain. They share a bond forged in the fires of the arena, a brotherhood of survival, but it is a fleeting one. Each man may fall at any moment. They live in a constant state of anxiety, not just for their own lives, but for the lives of their comrades, who are often their only family. This unspoken solidarity is a shield, but it is also a reminder that none of them is guaranteed a future. The reality, then, is often a mix of fleeting dreams and the harsh certainty that the fight may continue indefinitely. It is not the graphic violence of the arena that defines the toll they pay, but the long-lasting effects these injuries have on their bodies and minds. There are the constant bruises, the cuts that never seem to fully heal, and the aches that never quite fade. The constant threat of injury, of pain, and of death can fracture a gladiator's sense of self. Over time, these men may grow desensitized to the violence, numb to the suffering of their fellow warriors, and detached from their former selves. The long-term psychologicals, a deep sense of powerlessness, become as much a part of their identity as the deep lines carved into their faces from years of strife. The body is slowly worn down, each injury a permanent mark, a testament to the life they lead. The anticipation of the arena, with its violent spectacle, serves as a reminder that no matter how many victories one earns, no matter how well trained the body becomes, Death is always waiting just beyond the next fight. The body is pushed to its physical limits in the training yard and the arena, but the mind bears the heaviest burden. Hope is a bomb, yes, but it is also a slow poison. This realization is a bitter one, and it's impossible to ignore. When they enter the arena, they are not just fighting for survival, they are performing for an audience, for the people who cheer at every strike, at every death. The crowds see them only as warriors, as tools for their entertainment, not as humans with hopes, fears, and dreams of their own. The psychological toll of this realization is immense. It takes a quiet toll on the soul, grinding down the sense of self until all that remains is the brutal, mechanical drive to fight. It is the quiet belief that things might change someday, even though the odds are overwhelming. This undercurrent of dread follows each gladiator, whether he's awake, asleep, training, or resting. To be a gladiator is to exist not as an individual, but as an object on entertainment for the masses, a tool used for the purpose of sport. Their identities are wrapped up in their role as fighters, their worth determined by how well they can entertain, how well they can endure. The concept of a gladiator being more than a tool of violence is almost inconceivable. No one cares who they are as people, only how they perform, how many fights they win, and how many crowds they can thrill. The danger is never far from thought, never far from the soul. In a way, it becomes a part of his existence. Death is a looming shadow, following him every step, but the knowledge of its inevitability sharpens his focus. He knows, deep down, that each match could be his last. While the cheers of the crowd echoed through his mind, they are not the sweet sound of victory, but a reminder of the price he must pay to earn his place within the arena. It's a dangerous game, one where survival is never guaranteed, and the odds often seem stacked against him. In the heat of battle, the line between living and dying can blur with a single misstep. The thought that his life could end in a moment, a sword thrust, a misjudged parry, a slip on the blood-slicked sands is never far from his mind. But it is also a constant source of fear-annoying silent terror that festers under the surface. As much as the threat of death looms large, there is still a flicker of hope and ember that refuses to die. The faint hope of surviving another day, of earning the ultimate prize, freedom. For some gladiators, the rudis, the wooden sword that marks the end of their servitude, becomes a beacon in the distance, a symbol of all they have endured. Each match, each bloody fight, might bring them closer to that elusive dream. But this hope is fragile, a thin thread that stretches tighter with each battle. This daily tension between the flicker of hope and the crushing reality of their servitude is exhausting. Beneath the surface of their grueling routines and endless training lies a psychological strain that few outside the walls of the barracks could ever truly understand. The gladiators are more than warriors. They are commodities, bred and bought for their ability to fight and die for the pleasure of others. In the rare moments of rest, when the gladiators are away from the crowds and the stage of the arena, they may sit quietly with their thoughts. As the gladiators train and fight, injuries are an inevitable part of their existence. The sharp pain of a blade slashing across the arm or the searing ache of a dislocated shoulder becomes a familiar companion. But it's not just the body that bears these marks to psyche. The scars on their bodies, deep, jagged, sometimes faint, sometimes fresh, are the tangible symbols of their suffering. The emotional and physical toll of a gladiator's life is staggering. The transition from the quiet, exhausting repetition of the training grounds to the arena is sudden and jarring, like stepping from the familiar rhythms of a dream into the harsh, vivid light of reality. The shield, heavy, unyielding, is raised to ensure no fault in its composition, the worn surface bearing the marks of countless battles fought and survived. The light from a nearby torch flickers against the metal, casting long shadows that stretch and bend across the stone floor, as if the arena itself is holding its breath in anticipation. The blinding light of the midday sun strikes them hard, warming their armored bodies and making them acutely aware of the weight of the metal pressing down on their shoulders, their arms, their legs. The sand beneath their feet, fine and hot, seems to swallow their every step, each grain an inescapable reminder that this is the place where life and death collide. The gladiators can feel the weight of that toll as they stand there, suspended between life and death. They are not merely fighting an opponent, they are fighting for their very survival. A single slip, a single misstep, and it could all be over. The gladiator's body moves almost on instinct now, but every swing of the sword is accompanied by the lingering uncertainty. Will this be my last? Its metal edge gleams in the harsh light, but it is no longer a simple weapon. It is a tool for survival, its presence a reminder that death could come at any moment. The sand underfoot becomes a treacherous ground that slips with every hurried step. The fight is no longer just about victory, it is about leaving this place alive. And yet, the gladiator knows that survival is not always in his hands. Victory may not be his choice. The fight is no longer only physical, it is a mental battle, an internal struggle between the instinct to fight and the knowledge that, ultimately, the arena demands more than any one man can offer. The crowd's noise is deafening, but in those brief seconds of stillness before the next strike, it is all drowned out by the pounding of their own heart, the rush of blood in their ears, and the quiet whispers of their deepest fear. Am I going to make it out alive? The grip of the hilt is tight, almost too tight, but it provides some comfort, something solid to hold on to in a world where the ground constantly shifts beneath them. The moment they step into the arena, they are fully aware of the consequences of failure, death, or worse. It's the silence that occurs just before a blade strikes home, the breath held in anticipation, and the frightening realization that at any moment, that silence could be broken by the sound of metal against flesh. The psychological weight of that knowledge presses on them with every breath, with every heartbeat. It is a constant, gnawing presence, and it fuels their every move. Each strike, each defensive block, is motivated by the need to stay alive, not to win. The knowledge that the fight ahead is not just a test of skill or strength, and that knowledge feeds into the gladiator's fear, amplifying it to the point where every move seems like a gamble. The certainty of death and the uncertainty of survival entwine, making the mind race with thoughts that cannot be quieted, but one of endurance and sheer will to survive settles like a stone in the pit of their stomachs. Every muscle, every bone, is attuned to the sound of the crowd, the flashing images of weapons glinting in the sunlight, the heat that burns through their armor and the steady clench of their fists around their weapons. The arena stretches before them, immense, overwhelming, the crowd's roar, swelling around them like an ocean, rising to a fever pitch with each passing moment. Every muscle is tense, every nerve alight with anticipation and fear. The smell of sweat, food, and the distant scent of burning wood fills the air. It's an intoxicating mixture, one that makes the gladiators' stomachs churn in a way that has nothing to do with hunger. The sound of the crowd is deafening, a constant surge of voices that rise and fall with every shift of the gladiator's position. It is not a cheer for victory, but for survival. The audience does not know these men. They know only the violence, the spectacle, and the fear that bubbles just beneath the surface. The tension in the air is thick, almost suffocating, as men wait in a silent camaraderie. The gladiators can hear their own breaths, quick and shallow, the sound of their hearts pounding against their chests like the thundering drums of an approaching storm. The silence is almost unnerving. The wait for the clash of steel, the first strike that will break the stillness, is agonizing. The gladiators stand there, facing each other, their eyes meeting for a fleeting moment, and then quickly averting. In the space between, there is only the unspoken knowledge. This is it. There is no turning back now. There are no words, only the sound of heavy breathing, the quiet scraping of metal against leather, and the soft shuffle of feet shifting nervously in the dusty stone. In these final moments before the gates open, each gladiator can hear the murmurs of his companions, their hushed whispers, barely audible above the sound of their own anxious heartbeats. The final checks on armor and weapons are meticulous practica, almost ritualistic, like the final preparations of a soldier about to go into battle. Gladiators stand together in a narrow, dimly lit holding area beneath the arena's grand structure, adjusting their armor, making sure each strap is secure, each piece of metal in place. The cold steel of the sword is gripped tightly in gloved hands, the hilt pressing against the calloused palms, the weight of it strangely comforting and yet unnerving. Gladiators stand in near silence, their eyes not meeting, but their thoughts shared in the quiet understanding that this is not just a fight for victory, but for survival. You'll be fine. Just like in training, one says, but the words are hollow, carried away by the ever-present anxiety that no amount of training can ever fully erase. The reality of the arena is a different beast altogether. No practice drill, no sparring match, can prepare the gladiator for the cacophony of sounds, the scorching heat, the oppressive weight of the crowd's gaze, and the very real threat that this time, it may be his last. The moment the gates of the barracks open and the gladiators step into the sunlight, it feels as though the world shifts beneath them. The stands are filled with the faces of the people, their eyes bright with hunger, anticipation, and the thrill of bloodshed. But beneath the noise of the crowd, there is a terrifying silence, to the brief moment before the fight begins. The arena is not merely a stage for combat. It is a living, breathing entity, and it demands its toll. It's a feeling like no other, a cocktail of dread, fear, and adrenaline. The fight is no longer just a fight, it is an existential struggle, where the odds of surviving the day seem far less certain than they did during the grueling hours of training. As the fight begins, and the first clash of swords rings out, the arena is filled with noise, a deafening roar of the crowd, the clink of metal meeting metal, the grunts of exertion. The sword feels unnaturally cold in the gladiator's hand, as though it is a weight that carries both the promise of life and the certainty of death. There is a hollow echo in the arena, a feeling that cannot be put into words, but is felt by every gladiator who stands there. In those moments, everything becomes exaggerated. The heat of the sun feels scorching, and the sweat that drips down their faces seems to sting the skin. Each swing of the sword, each thrust of the trident, each desperate parry becomes a prayer, a cry for survival. In the quiet of the barracks, beneath the weight of the armor and the endless repetition of training, there remains a flickering hope that keeps the gladiators fighting, day after day. It is the symbol that a gladiator has earned his right to leave the arena behind, to step out of the shadows of servitude and into a life of his own choosing. It is a lifeline, fragile and distant, but still something to hold on to in the darkest moments. This hope is embodied in a single symbol: the rudisa, simple wooden sword, unadorned and weightless, yet to a gladiator, it represents something far more precious than any blade of steel. The idea of freedom, once so sweet and near, begins to lose its luster when faced with the harsh reality. Survival itself is the only guarantee in the gladiator-esque world. It is a cruel reminder that, despite all of their sacrifices and suffering, their fate is often not their own. The promise of freedom is illusory, a fleeting glimmer that can be snuffed out as quickly as it appears. The system that governs the gladiator's fate is a labyrinth of politics, money, and power far beyond the reach of any single fighter. The rudis may be given, but not all gladiators will ever hold it permanently in their hands. Some will die before they earn it. For the gladiator who holds the wooden sword in his hand, there is a mixture of exhaustion and elation, but also a deep sense of resignation. One day, they may be celebrated as champions, the rudis placed in their hands, and the next, they may find themselves back in the arena, sold to the highest bidder, or forced to fight for the amusement of another crowd. The unpredictability of their fate becomes a constant source of stress, undermining any hope for stability. Even if a gladiator receives the rudis, the mental toll doesn't simply end. The years of struggle, of being viewed not as a person, but as an object of entertainment, continue to shape his identity. There is no sense of triumph in the rudis, only a faint, quiet hope that somehow, someday, he might escape the arena. The mental and emotional strain of this life where hope is always just out of reach is perhaps the greatest burden of all. Others may be betrayed, sold again into servitude, or be kept in the arena for the entertainment of the people, long after their bodies have been worn to the point of exhaustion. The hope for freedom, though powerful, is often an illusion, an ember that fades in the harsh winds of reality. They fight not just for freedom, but to endure. They survive not out of hope for a better life, but out of the instinct to live another day. The rudis, that fragile symbol of freedom, is both a beacon and a trap, something to cling to when nothing else remains, but also a painful reminder of how far they still have to go. The rudis might be offered in a fleeting moment of hope, but for many the rudis may be held, but it is often never fully grasped. The psychological weight of this truth lingers, unspoken and undeniable, leaving many gladiators with an unshakable sense of resignation. They continue to fight, to endure, but at the core, they know that their hope is as fragile as the wood of the rudis itself. It will be little more than a token, something to hold in their hands for a brief moment, before the cold, indifferent machinery of the arena snaps back into place. The rudis, though it represents the possibility of freedom, is not a guarantee. The rudis is a gift, yes, but it can also be a subtle reminder of the price they have paid to earn it, the toll that the years of bloodshed have exacted on their bodies and souls. It is a piece of wood, yes, but it is also a constant reminder of the fleeting nature of hope in a world governed by cruelty and caprice. A gladiator's release is rarely as simple as winning this symbolic sword. Even if they survive the brutality of the arena, even if they triumph over every opponent and survive every battle, the decision to grant them freedom often rests in the hands of those who are far removed from their struggles. The rudis may be awarded in a moment of victory, but the reality of gaining true freedom is far more complicated, often a cruel twist of fate. The rudis is the ultimate reward, the promise of freedom after years of brutal combat. Imagine, if you will, the scene of a gladiator standing before the emperor, his arms raised in triumph. The crowd's roar fills the arena, a deafening wave of sound that washes over him. But it is not the cheers that he hears most clearly. It is the quiet thunk of the rudies, the wooden sword as it is placed in his hand. The grain of the wood is smooth beneath his fingers, the simple weight of it both comforting and bitter. This is the prize he has fought for, the key to his freedom. For the briefest of moments, he feels a surge of joy, an almost indescribable sense of relief. His fingers close around the hilt, and for the first time, he dares to believe that he might finally be free. Yet, as quickly as the joy surges, the reality of the situation crashes down. The rudies is not a guaranteed ticket to a new life. Its promise is a thin, fragile thread, and it is often contingent on forces far beyond the gladiator's control. Political maneuvering, the whims of the emperor, and the financial interests of the arena's owners all play a part in whether a gladiator is ever allowed to leave. Sometimes, the emperor may grant a gladiator the rudies as a token of favor, to enhance his own popularity with the crowd, or to remind the people of the rewards that await those who survive the arena. Other times, the decision is made to satisfy the whims of the audience, or perhaps to quiet the rumblings of a restless crowd eager for more spectacle. A gladiator, despite his victories, could find himself trapped in the arena for years, caught in a system that values him only as an instrument of entertainment. In the end, the rudies is more than just a wooden sword. It is a symbol of the fragile nature of freedom within the gladiatorous world. As gladiators train, fight, and sweat for the hope of earning a rudies, they are acutely aware of how fragile that hope is. It is not just about the number of victories earned or the wounds endured. Many gladiators, when they receive the rudies, may understand that it is a symbol more than a true path to freedom. The psychological toll of the rudies and its implications cannot be understated. Gladiators live with a quiet anxiety that accompanies a life in constant flux. The deep sense of resignation becomes part of the gladiator's psyche. For many gladiators, the true cost of their existence lies in this balance between endurance and hopelessness. In the heat of the arena, beneath the watchful eyes of thousands, the gladiators stand, each one a testament to the brutal world they inhabit. Their bodies, though strong and finely honed, bear the unmistakable marks of a life lived in constant battle. Dark, jagged lines crisscross their arms, chests, and faces, scars from swords, shields, and the unforgiving nature of the arena. These marks are not just physical. They are the history of their suffering, the permanent record of their survival. They are warriors, but they are also prisoners of their own fate. The way they walk tells a story of constant readiness, a slight hunched posture born from years of combat and anticipation. Each step is deliberate, measured, as though the weight of their armor, their weapons, and their own lives rests heavily on their shoulders. The skin has hardened over time, toughened by both the sun and the constant assault of weapons. It is a constant cycle, a loop of pain and survival that stretches out before them, without end. But once the applause fades, once the dust settles, they are once again led back to the barracks, to the cold stone floors. But it is always temporary, for another fight looms on the horizon. In the arena, there is no true victory, only the fragile hope of making it through another day. The gladiator's body, no matter how strong, no matter how resilient, will eventually succumb to the brutal demands of this life. And when it does, they will simply be replaced by another, their name forgotten, their legacy erased, just as quickly as they were thrust into the arena, and the thin straw mats where they will rest only to prepare for the next fight. The cycle begins again, as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. The arena calls to them again and again, each fight, each battle, pulling them back into the same rhythm. Prepare, fight, suffer, rest, repeat. They are warriors, but they are also prisoners of this cyclical existence, forced to fight not just for glory, not just for freedom, but for mere survival. The strength that was once fluid and boundless becomes stiff, slower, the muscles no longer as quick to respond, the joints creaking with the toll of repeated strikes and heavy blows. The one smooth surface has thickened over time, becoming like the calloused surface of the weapons they wield. They move with a stiffness that can't be eased by rest. Each joint protests with every movement. Every movement, every step, is weighed down by the knowledge of what has come before, the constant pain, the scars, the weariness of surviving for the sake of survival itself. And yet, there is still a flicker of something, perhaps pride, perhaps stubbornness, that keeps them moving, keeps them fighting. They endure, not because they are invincible, but because they have no choice. A gladiator who once stood tall with pride might now stoop slightly, the weight of years pressing down on his frame, each step heavy with the accumulation of battles fought and survived. It is a cycle of pain, of fleeting hope, of surviving the arena's demands, and living just long enough to face the next fight. The gladiator does not ask for sympathy. He simply asks for the chance to survive. He is, in the end, a reflection of the very life he leads, stuffed, battle-worn, and shaped by the brutal forces of the arena. Though they are still capable of great feats of strength and agility, the true cost of their survival is now clear. They have paid a price in The texture is rougher now, and while it may still shine in the sun, it carries the patina of age, a kind of dullness from the constant grind of combat. The deep lines carved into their faces tell stories of pain, fear, and resilience, but also of a surrender to the inevitable, the realization that each battle could be their last. Muscles that once rippled with energy now appear hardened like the wood of an old tree, weathered by years of exposure to the elements. The gladiator's arms and legs, once capable of explosive movements, now struggle under the weight of their own beta. The smoothness of their movements, once graceful and precise, has given way to a mechanical rhythm, a cycle of repeated action, hardened by the weight of armor and years of wear. Yet, despite the strength of their muscles, despite the hardened exterior, their bodies move with a certain weariness. There is a stiffness to their steps, a heaviness in their posture that speaks of fatigue deeper than mere physical exhaustion. Muscles, thick and bulging from years of training, ripple beneath the rough fabric of their tunics. Each sinew and tendon is taut with the tension of their past struggles, each movement deliberate, shaped by endless hours of combat. The arms, shoulders, and legs of these men and women are works of brutal, if unyielding, like the very weapons they wield. There is power in the way they move, but also a weariness, a silent testament to the relentless demands placed upon them. Their skin, once smooth and youthful, is now weathered and scarred from the relentless grind of battle. Their faces, once perhaps full of hope, now appear hardened, their expressions often distant, as though they've long since learned to guard any trace of emotion. Their eyes, once bright with ambition or defiance, are often dull flickers of awareness, still there, but dulled by the endless cycle of pain and survival. In the quiet moments before a battle, their gazes might shift across the arena, perhaps to their fellow gladiators or even to the crowd, but they look through everything, as if they've come to understand that survival is the only true focus in this world. It is not a question of winning or losing, it is a question of simply staying alive long enough to fight another day. Their movements, fluid but laced with exhaustion, reflect a body that has been stretched to its limits, hardened by a life of endless repetition. Over time, the gladiator's body begins to change in ways that cannot be hidden or ignored. The skin, though still resilient, is now an uneven map of scars, bruises, and abrasions. The gladiator's bones, too, have been worn down by the incessant clash of steel, the brutal impact of shields and swords. This slow, unrelenting degradation of the body is not something the gladiators can escape. The gladiators may win a battle, and for a fleeting moment, the crowd roars in approval. Each victory is but a temporary reprieve, a brief moment in which the gladiator can bask in the fleeting warmth of survival. The gladiator's body, once a vessel of power and grace, becomes a symbol. In the silence of the barracks, when the noise of the crowd fades, there is a quiet resignation in their eyes, a deep understanding that they are locked in a cycle they cannot escape. The arena, the Colosseum, was a place where fate was often decided not by the will of the gladiator, but by the whims of the crowd and the brutality of chance. The rise of a gladiator to fame was not always a matter of skill, ambition, or premeditated success. Most gladiators entered the games as slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals sentenced to fight for their lives. Their initial struggles were not focused on glory or recognition, but on survival. The harsh training, the constant threat of death, the grueling conditions, all of these elements were part of the gladiator's daily existence. As the gladiator's name begins to spread, the opportunities for more recognition grow, and with that recognition comes the pressure to deliver. The crowd estimates are often insatiable. What began as a moment of survival can quickly evolve into the expectation of brilliance. But it all starts with that first victory, that spark of recognition. In these early days, many gladiators were simply trying to make it through their first few battles, learning how to wield weapons and defend themselves against opponents far more experienced than they were. Wealthy patrons, the elite of Roman society, had a vested interest in the success of their gladiators, as victories would bring them honor and prestige. In the end, Gaius emerged victorious, not because of superior skill, but because he had managed to catch his opponent off guard. The crowd began to chant his name, demanding to see him fight again. His initial struggle for survival gave way to moments of brilliance that turned him into a crowd favorite. What started as an accidental victory became a career built on spectacle, skill, and determination, and at other times, a reflection of political or social forces beyond their control. For the few who were fortunate enough to rise to prominence, it offered the chance for freedom and glory. But as Gaius's story shows, even the most unlikely gladiators could find themselves standing at the center of the arena, their names etched in history, their fates shaped by forces they could neither predict nor control. For some, fame in the arena was a fleeting moment, an opportunity for survival that could end as quickly as it began. But for others, it marked the beginning of a new existence, one that was filled with both the glory of the crowd and the weight of the expectations placed upon them. Each match, each fight, was a stepping stone, gradually carving his name into the annals of history. Gaius had caught their attention not through flawless technique, but through his courage, his instinct, and his raw will to survive. His victories were still hard-won, but now, every fight was an opportunity for him to prove himself further. He was no longer simply fighting for survival, he was fighting for something more. And as his fame grew, so too did the pressure. The crowd's expectations for Gaius became more demanding, more relentless. But despite the weight of his new fame, he carried on, driven by the hope that each victory might one day bring him freedom. What followed was a moment of raw, human triumph for Gladiators' survival against all odds. The crowd, hungry for something more than just the bloodshed, saw in Gaius a spark, a glimmer of something more. He was no longer just a gladiator, he had become a symbol of defiance, an underdog who refused to be defeated. Through these connections, a gladiator's career could be given a significant boost. In fact, for many, fame came almost by accident, an unforeseen consequence of survival. A gladiator with charisma or a knack for impressing crowds could catch the eye of a patron who, seeing the potential for profit, might take him under their wing. The fame of a gladiator grew not just through skill, but also through the ability to entertain, to deliver something more than just a fight. And Gaius's rise was a testament to the fact that, in the arena, anything could happen. Fame could be as fleeting as a moment of brilliance, or it could be earned through years of grueling effort. But for Gaius, fame became the doorway to his future, a future that was far from certain, yet filled with possibilities that few gladiators would ever experience. With financial backing, a gladiator might find himself receiving better training, better equipment, and more opportunities to fight. Some gladiators, therefore, became not just fighters, but products, carefully cultivated by their patrons to become stars in the arena. A gladiator's path from obscurity to the cheers of the masses was often a perilous, unpredictable journey. When Gaius first stepped into the arena, he was a slave, stolen from his homeland and forced into the ranks of the gladiators. The crowd expected Tullius to emerge victorious with little effort. Gaius, however, was driven by something more than just survival. When cornered, with Tullius bearing down on him, Gaius managed to duck under a deadly blow, using the momentum to leap backward and land in a perfect position to strike at Tullius' unguarded side. It was a move so unexpected, so swift, that the crowd gasped collectively, and then, as one, they erupted into applause. He was young, inexperienced, and uncertain of his abilities. His first few matches were forgettable, he fought hard, but there was nothing extraordinary about his movements, nothing to suggest he would stand out among the countless others who had come before him. Perhaps a gladiator, new to the arena, faces a seasoned fighter, and through sheer luck, bravery, or an unanticipated maneuver, wins the fight. The crowd, always eager for spectacle, would be drawn to the underdog. There is something deeply captivating about a fighter who is outmatched, yet refuses to submit, whose every move is a desperate bid for survival. It's in these moments that the seeds of fame are sown not by design, but by the raw force of will and the ability to capture the crowd's attention. While some entered the arena with the ambition to be remembered as heroes, many simply fought to stay alive. Yet, within that struggle, some were fortunate enough to catch the attention of the crowd, to spark something that would propel them from lowly status to fame. At the beginning of a gladiator's life in the arena, the path to fame is far from clear. For some, the idea of fame was distant, almost irrelevant. Fame was something reserved for those with incredible skill or for those who had proven themselves in the arena time and again. But the reality for many gladiators was that they were just trying to avoid dying before their time. And yet, for a few, fate would have other plans. Fame in the arena could come as a result of an unexpected victory. A single victory could change everything for a gladiator. One unexpected win could lead to another match, another chance to prove oneself. A gladiator's rise to fame was untold, always about skill alone. It often involved making connections with influential figures who could offer financial backing and protection. While gladiators were often reduced to mere tools for entertainment, some found ways to leverage their positions. Consider the story of Gaius Lucius, a gladiator who began his journey in the arena as little more than a nameless, faceless fighter. But everything changed one day during a particularly brutal match against a seasoned veteran, Marcus Tullius, a man who had seen many battles and whose name was known across the empire. The veteran was stunned, his pride wounded by a blow he hadn't anticipated. From that day forward, Gaius's name was on the tongues of every citizen. His next few matches were met with eager anticipation. Gaius's rise to fame illustrates the gradual process by which some gladiators are thrust from obscurity into the spotlight. It wasn't just the victories that propelled him forward, it was the way he fought, the flair he brought to the arena, the way he connected with the crowd. The rise of a gladiator to fame was a complex journey, sometimes a result of sheer willpower. Fame, in the world of the gladiators, was not just a byproduct of victory, it was a double-edged sword that could bring both reward and ruin. Fame in the gladiatorial world is a double-edged sword. It can lift a man to heights of adulation, filling his heart with an intoxicating rush. But it can also isolate him, cutting him off from the very humanity that made him a warrior in the first place. For gladiators who rise to fame, there is often a constant internal battle. They are adored by the crowds, celebrated in the grand amphitheater, but they are not seen for who they truly are. They are reduced to object stools of entertainment for the people of Rome. The adoration of the masses, the golden wine at the feasts, the women who sought his favorite, all felt so distant when the crowd's roar faded away. Alone in the barracks, surrounded by other gladiators who were also fighting for their lives, Lucius felt an overwhelming loneliness. The camaraderie of battle was fleeting, for even his fellow gladiators saw him through the lens of his fame. He was no longer one of them. He was the champion, the hero, the untouchable warrior. His movements, once fluid and instinctive, now became more choreographed, more deliberate. These men are the nameless warriors who enter the arena, not to bask in glory, but to survive, often without the hope of ever leaving it. They fight for the same reasons, but without the promise of fame or adulation. He sees their quiet desperation, the same hunger for something more that once burned inside him. For Lucius and others like him, fame is both a gift and a curse. Fame, in the world of the gladiators, is fleeting. It is a game that offers brief highs, only to return them to the same cycle of violence, performance, and survival. The crowd may cheer, but the gladiator knows that this adoration is not for him, it is for the fighter he has become, the hero they wish him to be, not the man he truly is. It elevates them from the shadows, but it also traps them in a cycle of expectation and performance. The ordinary gladiators, who fight without the luxury of recognition, are freed from the burden of public adoration, but they too are bound by the same brutal system. Both worlds, the world of fame and the world of obscurity, are fraught with their own struggles, both mental and physical. Yet the famous gladiator, as celebrated as he might be, often stands alone at the top, separated from the very men he once fought, alongside, weighed down by the hollow emptiness of public adoration and the constant desire to maintain his status. And yet, despite the difference in their fame, they are bound by the same cycle, a constant struggle for survival, an endless series of battles, with no real escape. Lucius might feel pity for them, or perhaps envy. They are not weighed down by the expectations that come with fame. They are free in their own way. But freedom, too, comes at a cost. They will never know the thrill of being adored, never feel the power of the crowd's roar. They will never rise to the heights that Lucius has reached, and perhaps, in that silence, there is a greater form of peace. The life of an ordinary gladiator is grueling, brutal, and lonely. Unlike Lucius, whose every victory is met with cheers and praise, the unknown gladiator is barely acknowledged by the mass. His victories are forgotten almost as soon as the next battle begins. He began to practice his moves, perfecting his style for the entertainment of the masses. His fear of death, once his driving force, was slowly replaced by the fear of failing to meet the crowd's expectations. Every fight became an act of performance where victory was expected, and anything less was failure. The very thing that had made him stand out was the same thing that set him apart. He was isolated in a world full of people. They become symbols of strength, violence, and survival. But rarely are they seen as individuals with thoughts, emotions, or desires beyond the arena. His every fight is a battle, not just for survival but for recognition. He might dream of becoming a star, of hearing his name shouted by the crowd, but that dream is distant and unlikely. In a way, he is free. His actions are not dictated by the expectations of the public, but that freedom comes at a cost. The lack of recognition, the lack of connection to the people who fight for fame. The emotional toll on the unknown gladiator is just as severe as on the famous one, but in a different way. While Lucius fights to maintain his fame, the unknown gladiator fights to be seen, to be remembered. They admired him, yes, but they also resented him. He had become a symbol of what they all wanted but couldn't attain. He was no longer a comrade in arms, but a figurehead, a representative of the unattainable. Their conversations shifted from mutual respect to thinly veiled envy, and even the women who once sought his attention became distant, attracted not to the man, but to the image of strength he projected. The emotional turmoil of fame weighs heavily on those gladiators who have become popular. In the early days, every fight is a struggle for survival. The audience doesn't want to see mere combat, they want spectacle, drama, and showmanship. A gladiator who once fought with pure instinct now has to manage his reputation, deliver on the expectations of the crowd, and perform for the emperor's favor. In doing so, they often lose a piece of themselves. The rawness of survival is replaced by the calculated performance of a fighter who understands the game. Each movement is a desperate attempt to stay alive, a raw instinct to outlast the opponent. But as a gladiator becomes more well-known, his perspective shifts. No longer is he fighting for his life, he is fighting for the crowd. He becomes a performer, playing a part in a game that he no longer controls. The initial rush of victory, the roaring cheers of the crowd, is like a drug, intoxicating and addictive. Every gladiator, at some point, tastes this heady sense of adoration. They step into the arena, their hearts pounding in anticipation, but they know that the moment they raise their weapon, the crowd will watch. The feeling of having an entire empire focused on you is overwhelming, and in many ways, it's difficult not to let the power of that adoration seep into your soul. But for some, this adoration eventually becomes a burden. The famous gladiator begins to feel like a puppet, his strings pulled by the whims of the crowd and the desires of his masters. He was once an unknown slave, but after a stunning victory against a veteran, he became a household name. His fame grew rapidly. His name echoed in the forums, and statues were made in his likeness. Yet, despite the public's adoration, Lucius felt an increasing sense of isolation. The same crowd that cheered him on could just as easily turn against him with the next defeat. Behind his stoic facade, he grappled with the harsh truth that he was nothing more than a weapon, a tool for the enjoyment of others. As much as they may crave recognition, they also begin to feel a hollow emptiness within them, a sense that they are no longer seen as men, but as performing animals, brought to life only to kill or be killed. They become trapped in the persona that the public has crafted for them. For instance, consider Lucius Tiberius, a celebrated gladiator known for his strength and skill in the arena. At night, as he lay on his straw mat in the barracks, the silence of the cold stone walls would press down on him. This loneliness seeped into his relationships with others. The bond he shared with fellow gladiators, the shared experience of suffering and struggle, had become strained. As fame grows, the famous gladiator's psyche begins to change. This transformation is subtle, but over time, it becomes unavoidable. For Lucius, the moments of raw violence and survival, those early days of fighting for his life, slowly faded. In stark contrast to Lucius's fame is the life of the ordinary gladiator, who fights in relative obscurity, unseen by the crowds and forgotten by history. While Lucius might have felt the pressure of fame, the unknown gladiator feels the weight of anonymity. In a moment of reflection, Lucius might glance over at these fighters, the nameless men who fill the arena alongside him. In the end, the psychological toll of fame on a gladiator is undeniable. Lucius's fame may have brought him victory in the arena, but it has also left him hollow, isolated, and distant from the very humanity that once drove him. In the Grand Colosseum, where the roar of the crowd reverberates through the stands and the sun beats down on the blood-stained sand, gladiatorial combat becomes something more than mere survival. For those gladiators who have risen to fame, the fight is no longer just about staying alive, it is about entertaining, captivating, and winning over the man. The arena, once a brutal stage for death, transforms into a spectacle where each swing of the sword, each calculated movement, is as much a performance as a battle. The crowd expects more than the display of raw strength or tactical prowess. They want something theatrical, something that will dazzle their senses. A gladiator-esque movements must now balance two forces: the necessity to survive and the need to captivate the crowd. The roar of the crowd swells as the famous gladiator Maximus Aurelius steps into the arena. His muscles ripple beneath the weight of his armor, and his eyes, steely and focused, scan the audience. The noise of the crowd grows louder as they chant his name, eager to see the spectacle unfold. The emperor sits high in his seat, watching intently as the gladiator prepares for the fight ahead. The famous gladiator knows that while his survival is paramount, his ability to thrill and engage the audience is just as important. With each move, he amplifies the drama, delivering exaggerated, acrobatic strikes and daring maneuvers that thrill the spectators. The sand beneath their feet, the heat of the sun, the roars of the crowd, they are all part of the set. His behavior in the arena is not just about survival, it is about creating a story. He is performing for a living, breathing audience, and he cannot afford to disappoint them. He knows that his performance will be recounted in taverns and forums, that his name will live on as long as the people remember his feats. He is not fighting in isolation. He is aware that every move he makes is being watched, scrutinized, and judged. He becomes acutely aware of how he is perceived, and his mind, once focused purely on survival, is divided between the demands of combat and the need to entertain. The tension between these two forces, fighting for life and performing for the crowd, become the core of a gladiator's emotional and psychological experience. Even when he is alone in the barracks, preparing for the next battle, his mind drifts back to the expectations of the crowd. The fight, for him, is no longer just about survival, it is about sustaining the spectacle, about holding on to his place in the crowd's affections. The gladiator in the arena becomes a storyteller, shaping the narrative of his survival with every motion. They cheer when he performs a risky move, when he risks injury for the sake of drama. They love the theater of it, the feeling that they are witnessing not just a fight, but a story unfold before them. And so, with each fight, his performances become more extravagant. He might even throw in a flourish after a particularly difficult move, spinning his sword, leaping in the air to play to the crowd. The more he captures their attention, the more they demand. The crowd's reactions influence his actions. If they cheer loudly after a bold move, he may repeat it, knowing that they crave more of the same. If their cheers falter, he may change tactics, throwing in a risky maneuver to reignite their excitement. In the back of his mind, even as he fights to stay alive, he is already imagining how the story of this battle will be told. The crowd's roar can turn to tears in an instant if they feel the performance lacks excitement. For the famous gladiator, the fight is never just about the deeds, about how he makes the audience feel. The tension and anticipation he builds with every calculated gesture. Every gladiator who steps into the arena is aware that his actions will be judged, not just by the emperor or the arena's owner, but by the millions of eyes that gaze down upon him. There is an awareness that each movement, each breath, is being consumed by the crowd. It's a pressure that only grows as a gladiator's fame rises. He leaps into the air, spinning with his sword outstretched, narrowly missing his opponent's guard. The crowd roars. Every movement is purposeful, deliberate. His swordplay becomes a dance, each strike and parry more than a technique. It is part of the larger performance, a story being told in real time. The gladiator doesn't just fight to win, he fights to entertain, to be remembered. This is his stage, his opportunity to remind the people why he is adored, why his name is spoken with reverence. The crowd is not just there to see blood spilled, they are there to see drama unfold, to witness the art of combat in its most exaggerated and theatrical form. Maximus's sword swings with precise efficiency, a calculated strike aimed at his opponent's shoulder, but the crowd is restless. They want more. It is not just the fear of death that weighs on the gladiator, it is the fear of being forgotten. He is aware that a moment of dullness, a misstep, a fight that doesn't meet expectations, could erase everything he's worked for. His name, which once echoed through the streets of Rome, could become another forgotten tale in the annals of history. Maximus senses this, the energy of the crowd, like a living thing, pushing him to deliver something greater. The sun glints off his armor, and he strikes a pose that seems almost It's a moment of pure spectacle. He's not just fighting, he's performing, telling the story of the gladiator who conquers, not just his opponent, but the hearts of those who watch him. For the famous gladiator, the arena is not only a place of violence, it is a stage. In that moment, Maximus spins, his movements a blur of speed and elegance, and delivers a quick strike to the man's side, causing him to stagger back. But it isn't just the strike that captures the audience, it's the flourish. The way Maximus spins, the way he holds his sword with the elegance of a dancer rather than a fighter. The crowd gasps in awe, their cheers rising in response to the showmanship. His movements, his strikes, his postures, all of them are crafted not only to win the battle, but also to delight the onlookers. The crowd's expectations shape every part of the combat, as they anticipate more than just a fight. They want a show. As a gladiator grows in fame, his fights become increasingly defined by the need to entertain. A gladiator's fame often hinges on how well he can blend athleticism with spectacle. His performance in the arena can elevate him from a mere survivor to a beloved hero. Each fight becomes an opportunity to craft a performance, using dramatic flourishes to impress the audience. For some gladiators, particularly the well-known ones, every move is an opportunity to tell a story of power, grace, and triumph. The crowd wants to see a fighter who is more than just skilled. They want to see a fighter who can evoke emotion, who can draw them into the narrative of his struggle. Imagine the arena now, the sun high in the sky, casting harsh shadows over the sand. The opponent, a seasoned fighter, perhaps older and less agile, stands opposite Maximus, his stance more cautious. But Maximus knows this is not just a fight for survival. The battle begins. At first, it is a traditional exchange to gladiators sizing each other up, weapons clashing, each fighter testing the other's defenses. He feints to the right, and his opponent, expecting the attack, shifts his weight to block. Maximus pauses for a moment, standing tall, his sword raised in a dramatic arc as if acknowledging the crowd's adoration. As the battle continues, Maximus plays to the crowd even more. The arena itself is the backdrop to this spectacular stage where gladiators are not simply fighting for their lives, but are performing for the gods and the people. The famous gladiator understands this better than anyone. Maximus knows that as the crowd cheers, their eyes are fixed on him, dissecting every movement, looking for signs of greatness. This dynamic between gladiator and audience creates a kind of psychological pressure. Maximus, with every swing of his sword, is fighting not just for survival but for a legacy. The gladiator's awareness of the audience's gaze is something that shapes his entire approach to combat. This dynamic has a profound impact on a gladiator's behavior in the arena. Maximus knows, for example, that the crowd loves a daring act. This awareness, this pressure to perform, never leaves him. In the heart of ancient Rome, the gladiators were more than just warriors. They were political tools, pawns in the games of power, and their fame could be shaped and controlled to serve the ambitions of those in control. The intersection of gladiatorial fame and politics was inevitable, for, in the Roman Empire, nothing was ever simply about survival or spectacle. It was always about power, influence, and the subtle manipulation of the mass. The gladiatorial games, as brutal and bloody as they were, offered a unique platform for politicians, emperors, and wealthy patrons to project strength, maintain control, and influence public opinion. In many cases, gladiators were no longer just entertainers. They were symbols, embodiments of the values, fears, and desires of the empire. Their victories in the arena, their moments of glory, could be woven into the fabric of political strategy, used to gain favor with the people or distract them from the political turmoil beneath the surface. One of his prized gladiators, Antonius, rose to fame after defeating a series of skilled opponents, his name quickly becoming synonymous with strength and resilience. Gladiators, in many ways, were mere commodities, bought and sold to serve the desires of their masters. The games were not merely a form of entertainment, but a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to manipulate the masses. By staging grand spectacles, including elaborate gladiatorial contests, emperors could both pacify and distract the people of Rome, keeping them entertained while subtly reinforcing their authority. The famous gladiators, the ones who captured the public's imagination, could be co-opted as political symbols embodying the values the emperor wanted to project. Their personal desires, whether for fame, glory, or freedom, were. Public spectacles were often used to mark important occasions or to reward the masses. Spartacus led a massive slave revolt that was fueled by his initial experiences as a gladiator. Unlike most gladiators, Commodus fought not as an enslaved man but as the ruler of Rome, seeking to prove his own strength and right to rule through the spectacle of combat. His gladiatorial victories were used as propaganda to maintain his power, although his participation also exposed him to ridicule, as many saw his actions as beneath the dignity of an emperor. Even if a gladiator survived the games, earned the rudies, and was granted freedom, their fate often depended on whether the political powers in Rome still found them useful. It was often a token of favor given to please the crowds or gain favor with the populace. Maximus, after years of brutal combat, might have been granted his freedom, but this could be overturned if the emperor felt threatened by his growing popularity. Fame in the arena could be as much a political tool as a personal achievement. Patrons and sponsors used gladiators to enhance their social standing. Emperors wielded them to consolidate power, and political forces used them to manipulate the masses. Gladiators, once seen as nothing more than slaves, could rise to immense fame, but their freedom and ultimate fate were almost always determined by the political powers controlled Rome. The intersection of gladiatorial fame and politics was a delicate dance, one that often ended with the gladiator's body in the sand, his name forgotten as the next great warrior rose to take his place. Fame, in the world of the gladiators, was both a weapon and a trap, an illusion of freedom that could be granted or taken away at any moment by those who held power over the games. If a gladiator became too powerful or too influential, they were often disposed of in favor of the next great spectacle. This was the danger of fame in the arena. The emperor might grant a gladiator freedom, but that decision was often made based on political advantage, rather than an assessment of the gladiator's. His own manipulation of his image as a gladiator ultimately contributed to his downfall. When it becomes too detached from the dignity of office, can become a liability. His appearances in the arena were a form of political performance, designed to demonstrate his power over life and death. The emperor could change his mind, and the games would continue without pause, as new champions and new gladiators emerged to take the place of those who had risen to power. For the gladiator, freedom was always in jeopardy, and the possibility of falling out of favor, whether through political maneuvering or the fickleness of the crowd, was a constant fear. Commodus, despite being an emperor, believed that the crowd's love and adoration could solidify his position. By fighting in the arena, he sought not only to entertain but to send a message to the people that their emperor was as capable of brutal violence as any gladiator. As his fame grew, so did the political stakes. He became a symbol of resistance, not just to the Roman political system, but to the aristocracy that used gladiators as a tool to maintain power. The Roman political elite, fearing the power of a popular figure like Spartacus, mobilized armies to defeat him. His fame as a gladiator-turned-leader was used by the Roman authorities to reinforce their own narrative of control, showing the people that even the mightiest of gladiators, once slaves, could be crushed by the strength of the Roman Empire. Emperors would sponsor games to solidify their rule, distract from political scandals, or celebrate military victories. It was not uncommon for gladiators to become pawns in these political games, fighting not only for their survival, but as part of a larger narrative shaped by the emperor. The people of Rome adored Antonius not just because of his prowess in the arena, but because they saw him as an extension of Decimus's own power. Decimus paraded Antonius through the streets, presenting him as a symbol of his own wealth and status. The gladiator's fame brought Decimus the public adoration he craved, and in turn, the senator became a political force to be reckoned with. His influence bolstered by his association with such a celebrated figure. Gladiators fought in his name, becoming symbols of his strength and dominance. Likewise, Emperor Nero used gladiators as a means of distraction during times of political unrest, using their victories and brutal performances to soothe a restless populace. The games were a reminder to the people that the emperor had control over life and death. He had the power to give them both entertainment and the illusion of safety. Patrons and sponsors, wealth and power behind the gladiators' fame. No matter how celebrated they became, gladiators were never truly free, unless the emperor himself decided to grant them liberty, a decision that was rarely made based on merit or fame. The emperor's use of gladiators was one of pure political expedient. The public spectacle of a champion gladiator becoming the face of their patroness, wealth and power helped to cement the patroness reputation as someone capable of controlling the gladiatorial games and, by extension, the hearts of the people. The life of a gladiator was often shaped by the patronage of the wealthy elite. Wealthy sponsors, including politicians, senators, and influential aristocrats, often controlled gladiators' careers. These patrons had a vested interest in the success of their gladiators, not just for the sake of the games, but to bolster their own political standing. A gladiator's victories were as much a reflection of the power and influence of their patron as of their own abilities. For a powerful Roman patron, sponsoring a successful gladiator was an effective way to solidify their status within the social and political hierarchy. Consider Decimus Aurelius, a wealthy senator who backed a number of gladiators. However, this relationship was not one of mutual respect but of power dynamics. For the emperor and politicians, gladiators were tools to be used to consolidate power and control the public's perception. The gladiator games were a tool for emperors to display their wealth and military might. For example, Emperor Augustus, understanding the power of public perception, used the games to display his power and generosity to the people of Rome. But, as in the case of famous gladiators, their fate often remained beyond their control. Famous gladiators like Spartacus and Commodus illustrate how gladiatorial fame could intersect with a larger political narrative, both in their use as symbols and in the manipulation of their personal stories. Spartacus, the most famous gladiator of them all, did not rise to fame because of any political ambition, but because of the sheer power of his rebellion. Commodus, the emperor who fought as a gladiator in the arena, is another example of the political power of gladiatorial fame. In Commodus's case, his fame in the arena was intertwined with his political ambition. The role of fame in a gladiator's future was always precarious, shaped more by political forces than by personal merit. Famous gladiators like Maximus Aurelius might gain the rudes, but this did not guarantee freedom in any meaningful sense. For many, the rudes was a fleeting promise. The gladiators' lives were shaped by far more than their own actions. Fame, in the brutal and high-stakes world of the gladiators, is a powerful force. It is intoxicating in its early days, a reward for the skill, courage, and determination required to survive the arena. When he first steps into the arena, it is often with the singular goal of making it through the day. But when the crowd begins to chant his name, when the emperor offers him favors, and when the arena becomes his stage, something begins to shift. The fight is no longer just about surviving, it is about performing. He was no longer just a man with a sword, he was Maximus Aurelius, the gladiator whom the crowds adored, whom they expected to win every match, and whose performances were a matter of public spectacle. Every time he entered the arena, he was not only fighting for his life, he was fighting for his reputation. The crowd didn't just want him to survive, they wanted him to entertain them, to dazzle them with every strike and flourish. The gladiator is no longer fighting for himself. He is fighting for the crowd, for the emperor, for the political forces that have lifted him to this point. The rising star who once enjoyed the excitement of battle can quickly find himself trapped in a cycle of expectations that only leads to more pain. As he won battle after battle, his fame spread far and wide, but with each victory, the arena began to demand more from him. He was no longer just a fighter, he had become a living trophy, an icon to be paraded around and admired. Each time the crowd cheers, it feels like a victory, but each time they demand more, each time they call for a greater spectacle, greater violence, greater drama. The gladiator's sense of self fades. The scars on his body, once badges of honor, now felt like reminders of his brokenness. He had survived because he was strong, but the toll on his mind and spirit had been far greater. Every victory, every roar from the crowd, only reminded him of his imprisonment within the arena. His fame had trapped him, and no matter how many times he raised his sword in victory, he would always be just another gladiator, another object of public entertainment. But with each victory, he found himself performing not for survival, but for the crowd. Fame, at first a beacon of hope, quickly becomes a prison. The arena, a place once filled with the raw energy of survival, becomes a hollow stage for performance, where every victory is a fleeting moment and every defeat a reminder of the ever-present pressure to entertain. The pressure to perform, to satisfy the crowd's never-ending thirst for spectacle, eats away at the very essence of who the gladiator once was. Maximus, who once fought for survival, now fights for nothing but the approval of the crowd. A cruel irony for a man who was once free in his struggle, but who now finds himself a prisoner of his own success. For Maximus, and many like him, the arena is no longer a place of freedom, it is a place of perpetual performance. A theater where the line between survival and entertainment becomes ever more blurred. His moves became more flamboyant, designed to incite a roar from the masses rather than to ensure victory. He would leap higher, strike harder, and taunt his opponents, anything to draw the crowd's applause, the very thing that once freed him from obscurity. The adoration of the public becomes his cage. What had once been a way of life, a fight for survival, had become a stage show, a spectacle to feed the insatiable desires of the audience. As he walked back to his quarters after each fight, the cheers of the crowd still ringing in his ears, he felt nothing but emptiness. The applause no longer felt like a victory, it felt like a demand. The gladiator who once fought for his life, now fought to maintain his reputation. Every battle was a test of his ability to entertain, to impress, but in the process, he lost sight of why he had fought in the first place. The joy he once took in fighting, in the pure simplicity of combat and survival, began to fade. Instead, there was a growing sense of dread in the pit of his stomach. Every time the gates of the arena opened, women flocked to him, eager to be seen with the victorious gladiator. The crowd's adoration filled him with a sense of power, but soon, the weight of the public's expectations started to press down on him. The thrill of victory fades quickly, and what remains is the anxiety of knowing that the next fight will only raise the stakes higher. As the gladiator's fame grows, so too does the scrutiny. The crowd's love, which once felt like a reward, now becomes a heavy weight on his shoulders. It is no longer about surviving the fight, it is about living up to the public's image of him. His body had become a well-oiled machine of combat, but his soul, his spirit, was slowly withering. He no longer fought with the abandon he once had, but with calculated moves, with an eye on the crowd, ensuring that each strike and block was dramatic, even if it put him at a tactical disadvantage. He had become a performer, and this performance, as dazzling as it might seem, was slowly hollowing him out. Yet, as the gladiator's renown grows, so too does the pressure to maintain that fame, until it becomes a heavy burden. Each victory, each battle won, only leads to greater expectations, and with those expectations comes a heavier burden to perform. What begins as a thrilling experience surviving and winning gradually morphs into an exhausting routine where the gladiator is no longer the architect of his own fate. Instead, he becomes a puppet of the arena, manipulated by the whims of the crowd, the emperor, and the very system that created him. What began as a single victory, maybe even a lucky one, is now seen as the beginning of something larger. The audience wants more. They expect greater feats, more dramatic combat, and ever more spectacular performances. The gladiator, who might have once fought with the raw, untamed energy of survival, now finds himself weighed down by the need to entertain. Each victory, while sweet in the moment, only brings with it the pressure of having to top it next time. For many, the very thing that once offered them the hope of recognition and escape then becomes their prison. What began as a symbol of survival, a way to achieve a degree of autonomy, often morphs into a relentless cycle of expectation, one that strips away any sense of personal agency and turns the gladiator into little more than an object of public adoration. The public's expectations grow as the gladiator's fame increases. For Aurelius Maximus, a gladiator who became a household name after defeating multiple champions in the arena, this shift was particularly profound. At first, his rise to fame had been exhilarating. The crowd loved him for his ruthless efficiency, his athleticism, and his tactical intelligence. But as the weeks turned into months, and his victories accumulated, so too did the expectations. Maximus began to feel trapped. This constant pressure began to erode his sense of self. This vicious cycle of fame is one that ensnares many gladiators. The cycle is relentless. Win a fight, receive accolades, fight again, win again, and repeat. Maximus's story is not unique. Maximus's fame, though it elevated him from a lowly slave to a celebrated hero, came at a significant cost. At first, the perks were undeniable. Maximus was granted more luxurious accommodations, better weapons, and the attention of powerful patrons who showered him with riches and favors. Maximus had always been a man of strategy, using his mind as much as his strength to win his battles. But the performances began to wear on him. Maximus began to question whether surviving in the arena was worth the cost. The irony of glory in the gladiatorial world is that the more famous a gladiator becomes, the more he loses his sense of self. Maximus's internal struggle, the growing distance between the man he once was and the persona he had to adopt, reflects the larger reality for famous gladiators. In the end, fame in the gladiatorial world, while offering fleeting glory and adoration, can strip a man of his humanity. In the brutal world of the gladiators, the motivations for seeking fame were as varied as the men who entered the arena. The clash of steel and the roar of the crowd became both a battleground for survival and a stage for the gladiators to pursue something more, something beyond the mere act of surviving, while the end goal was often the same: freedom, or at least a life of some dignity. How a gladiator pursued fame depended on his background, his desires, and the circumstances that brought him to the sands of the Colosseum. Some sought glory, others sought wealth, and for many, fame was the only hope of achieving freedom. Each gladiator entered the arena with his own reasons, and each fight became an opportunity to either move closer to his dreams or face the cold reality of his circumstances. The motivations for pursuing fame in the arena were diverse, each gladiator driven by a personal ambition that often went beyond the mere bloodshed of the games. Gladiators like him sought the immortality of their names, etched into statues, recounted in stories, their images adorned on coins. Glory, for these men, was their final reward. Rufus was a slave, but he was also with each victory, he won the favor of wealthy patrons who sought to sponsor him. His name became known, and with it came rewards, rich gifts from admirers, the promise of land from a senator who wished to associate with his fame. A gladiator's rise to fame was often the only path to freedom in a system that offered few opportunities for advancement. He fought with a singular focus, not to entertain or win glory, but to survive long enough to be noticed by the emperor. For Marcellus, fame was simply the gateway to the Rudes. He fought with everything he had, not for the promise of riches or adoration, but for the opportunity to one day stand free. Fame in the arena meant recognition by the emperor, and recognition from the emperor often meant the possibility of release. While his primary goal was survival, Rufus knew that his victories could provide for a future he might otherwise never have had. Fame in the arena is a delicate balance. The gladiator's very survival depends on his ability to win, but his fame depends on his ability to entertain. The need to stay alive must be reconciled with the need to perform for the crowd. His fame in the arena became his ticket to wealth and opportunity for a man who had nothing to gain something extraordinary. For some, fame offered a sense of control over their fate, a means of asserting autonomy in a world of servitude, but ultimately demands a price that only the bravest or the most desperate are willing to pay. Yet, for all the rewards it offered, fame often came at a steep price. The famous gladiator found himself trapped in a cycle of expectation and performance, forced to live up to the public's ideal of what he should be, while losing sight of the very thing that had once driven him. Survival. The pursuit of glory could lead to disillusionment, as the gladiator became a prisoner of his own success, sacrificing his sense of self for the adoration of the crowd. A rising star, Gaius had once fought for survival, fighting to stay alive and earn the favor of his masters. Could he continue to fight for fame without compromising his safety? Would the pressure to entertain ultimately lead him to make a fatal mistake? The desire for glory and the drive for survival often collide, leading to moments of deep personal disillusionment. The famous gladiator may gain everything: wealth, fame, freedom, but at what cost? The pursuit of fame is a double-edged sword, offering glory but demanding personal sacrifice. As the gladiator rises to the top, he must constantly navigate the fine line between maintaining his place in the arena and losing sight of the one thing that brought him there: survival. In his most vulnerable moments, Gaius questioned whether it was worth it. The glory that came with each victory now felt increasingly hollow, weighed down by the burden of public expectation. But as his fame grew, so did the expectations. He began to fight less out of necessity and more out of the need to live up to the image the crowd had built for him. He was forced to perform for the crowd, to put on a show, even though all he wanted was to leave the arena behind. But the fame that came with his victories slowly brought him closer to his goal. The crowd loved him, and soon, the emperor took notice. As his victories mounted, he began to gain the favor of the emperor. But more importantly, he started to command the respect of those who controlled the gladiators. This shift in power allowed Marcus to leverage his fame, demanding better living conditions, more favorable matchups, and, eventually, even the right to leave the arena if he ever chose to. Fame had, in his case, become a form of resistance to the system that had once enslaved him. His fame, once a means of survival, became the vehicle for his eventual release. In this case, fame did not bring wealth or glory, but it brought Marcellus the one thing that had eluded him for years: freedom. These men were not merely fighting to survive, they were fighting for recognition, for the glory that would be immortalized in the stories of Rome. Fame provided them with a degree of autonomy. In a world where they had none, the more famous they became, the less likely they were to be treated like mere property. They gained influence, not over their fate in the arena, but over their treatment outside it. As gladiators rose to prominence, they often found that their fame gave them more power in the arena, the potential to negotiate better conditions, and in some cases, the opportunity to demand respect from their masters. Many of the more successful gladiators were handsomely rewarded for their victories, with their wealth rising as their fame grew. Gold, land, and luxurious gifts often followed in the wake of their success. It was about securing a comfortable future, whether for himself or his family, and perhaps even ensuring a place in Roman society once his time in the arena was done. Fame, in this case, was the key to unlocking wealth. And wealth was freedom, the kind of freedom that could come only with financial security. Wealth could buy a gladiator's freedom or provide for his family if he ever returned home. To be famous in the arena was to be remembered by future generations, a legacy that could last long after their death. It was the promise of becoming a legend and eternal hero in a world where the greatest battles were fought and won in public. For some gladiators, fame was the ultimate goal. They entered the arena with the singular hope of winning the Rudes, the wooden sword that symbolized a gladiator's release from servitude. The Rudes was a beacon of hope, a symbol that a gladiator had earned his liberty. Titus had come from humble origins, and as a slave in the gladiatorial school, he had little hope for the future. But within him burned the desire for something greater. He trained relentlessly, not just to survive but to excel, knowing that the crowd's adoration was the only way he would ever escape his circumstances. The cheers of the people, the adulation of the emperor, this was the dream that propelled him forward. For Titus, the arena was a stage, and each battle was a performance. Every victory was another step toward achieving the ultimate glory, becoming a Roman hero. Take Titus Varro, a gladiator who entered the games with the sole ambition of becoming a household name. Fame for men like Titus Varro wasn't just about survival. It was about crafting a legacy, being remembered not as a nameless fighter, but as a legend. Other gladiators fought not for glory, but for the wealth that came with fame. Take Caius Rufus, a gladiator who rose to fame in the arena not because he sought recognition, but because he saw the games as a chance to build a fortune. For Rufus and others like him, the fame that came with being a successful gladiator wasn't about honor or legacy. Then there were gladiators who fought not for glory or wealth, but for the chance at true freedom. For these men, fame was not a goal in itself, but a means to an end. Marcellus, a gladiator who had been captured in battle and sold into slavery, saw the games as his only chance for liberation. Marcellus's journey was not without sacrifices. For some gladiators, fame wasn't just about surviving or achieving glory, it was about control. Fame, for these gladiators, became a form of resistance. It was a way to assert some control over their otherwise brutal and constrained lives. Take Marcus Decimus, another famed gladiator who knew that his growing reputation gave him power over his masters. At the heart of every gladiator's pursuit of fame lies a complex internal conflict. How does one pursue glory without losing sight of survival? For Gaius Aurelius, this conflict was apparent every time he entered the arena. Gaius, though talented and skilled, began to wonder whether his desire for glory had blinded him to the fact that survival was the ultimate goal. The internal conflict for a famous gladiator is never easily resolved. The motivations for fame in the gladiatorial world were varied, from the quest for glory to the pursuit of wealth and, ultimately, freedom. Fame, in the world of the gladiators, is a complicated, dangerous pursuit, one that offers the promise of greatness. The gladiatorial arena, a place where men fought to the death, also became a stage for the fleeting spectacle of fame. Gladiators, once forgotten slaves or criminals, could rise to dizzying heights, their names etched into the minds of the Roman populace. Their victories were celebrated, their feats of strength and courage lauded. Quintus had become one of the most famous gladiators of his time, his victories stacking up like trophies, each one bringing him closer to the ultimate prize, the Rudes, his freedom. The crowds loved him, his name chanted from the rooftops of Rome, and the emperor himself took a liking to him, showering him with rewards and praises. His fame, once dazzling, was as fleeting as a shadow in the sun. The victory that had given him recognition was overshadowed by his loss, and the gladiator who had once been Rome's champion was reduced to another forgotten name among the countless fighters who had graced the sands. His fate was a stark reminder of the transience of glory in the arena. One moment, you could be the toast of the empire. The next, just another footnote in the history of bloodshed. Their identity was reduced to their ability to perform, their value tied to their ability to satisfy the crowd's thirst for spectacle. The gladiator who was once celebrated for his victories was soon forgotten when his body grew too weary to fight, or when a newer, younger fighter rose to take his place. Fame, once a symbol of power and glory, became a cruel reminder of the shortness of life in the arena. No matter how many battles they won, no matter how beloved they became, gladiators were still bound to the arena. The crowd's love was just another fleeting element in their world of violence and survival. While fame may offer moments of adoration and success, it is ultimately it provides brief moments of glory, but it also traps them in a cycle of performance and survival. In the end, the arena is not just a place of combat, it is a place where even the brightest stars can burn out, leaving only the harsh reality of violence and sacrifice in their wake. The crowd's love is fleeting, and the glory earned through battle is often followed by an even darker reality. The true cost of survival in the gladiatorial arena is not only physical, it is emotional, psychological, and existential. Even those who rise to the top, like Valerius, find themselves discarded, their names forgotten, their legacies washed away in the endless tide of combat and spectacle. The adoration of the masses was intoxicating, but it was also fleeting. Their moments of glory were indeed brief, but in that brief time, they held something powerful, a connection with the people, a recognition of their strength and endurance. However, this connection was not built on any deep respect for their humanity. It was built on spectacle, on the momentary thrills that they could provide to the mass. A gladiator's rise to fame was as much about the public's fleeting affection as it was about their own skill in the arena. Gladiators could rise to the heights of public adoration, but they could just as easily fall from grace, discarded in favor of the next champion. Even the greatest gladiators, once famous, would find themselves battling not just in the arena, but with their own sense of identity, their place in a world that saw them only as tools for entertainment. And when the crowd's attention shifted to the next great fighter, the gladiator was left to grapple with the emptiness of fame. They fought not just for survival, but for the approval of the public, for a fleeting sense of glory that could vanish as quickly as it arrived. And when the crowd's attention moved on, they were left with nothing but the echoes of their former triumphs. Fame, in the world of the gladiators, was both a gift and a curse, offering brief glory, but demanding endless sacrifice. The realization that they were not truly free and that their worth was now defined by the whims of others. He was, for a time, the very embodiment of Roman strength and valor. The gladiator's body, forged through pain and sacrifice, became a testament to the price of survival. Gladiators like Valerius, who rose to fame, had to constantly weigh the battle between maintaining their public image and the toll that performing for the crowd took on their souls. The more they fought to entertain, the more they lost themselves in the process. What had begun as a fight for survival became a fight to live up to the expectations placed upon them. Every battle left its mark, physical scars, but also emotional and psychological wounds that often took years to heal, if they ever healed at all. Fame, no matter how bright, could not protect the gladiator from the long-term toll of endless combat. But, as the sands of the arena were swept clean after each battle, so too were the memories of these men often swept away in the same brutal fashion. During a major contest in the Colosseum, he faced a younger, stronger opponent, a fighter with a style that was unfamiliar and unpredictable. Despite Valerius's extensive experience, the battle took a turn for the worse. In a moment of overconfidence, Valerius made a misstep that led to his defeat. The crowd, which had once roared for him, turned to G. They demanded a better spectacle, and in their eyes Valerius had become just another fallen warrior. His name, once spoken with reverence, quickly faded from the public's memory. Fame, in the world of the gladiators, was as transitory as the blood that stained the sands beneath their feet. The rise and fall of a gladiator's fame often took place in the blink of an eye, a sharp contrast to the long hours of brutal training and battle that built their reputation. The adulation of the crowds could be intoxicating, praise for every victory, cheers for every well-executed move, but the same adoration could disappear just as quickly. For many, fame in the arena was an illusion, as fleeting as the wind in the amphitheater. Take the case of Valerius Quintus, a gladiator who once dazzled the crowds with his skill, agility, and dramatic flair. But, as quickly as he had risen, Valerius's fate changed. In the months that followed, Valerius was forgotten, cast aside in favor of the next rising star. While fame brought moments of glory, it also carried with it an immense cost. For many, the true cost of survival was not simply the injuries sustained during fights, but the erosion of their sense of self. The emotional toll was equally significant. Fame in the arena meant that a gladiator was no longer seen as a man, but as a tool for entertainment. Even the greatest of gladiators were not immune to this cycle. As gladiators like Valerius rose to fame, they were acutely aware of the irony of their situation. The irony of gladiatorial fame is that while it offers recognition, it also demands constant sacrifice. In the end, many famous gladiators found their fame was the very thing that trapped them. The gladiator's path to fame is both dazzling and treacherous, a journey that promises glory but often leads to disappointment. For the gladiators, fame is a double-edged sword. It offers recognition, but at the cost of their personal agency. In the midst of the blood-soaked sands of the arena, gladiators were transformed into living legends, their names etched into the annals of Roman history, forever associated with strength, sacrifice, and spectacle. But the origins of their existence remain shrouded in mystery, and understanding how this brutal practice evolved from a ritualistic act into a grand public spectacle is as complex and layered as the fighters themselves. How did this tradition, so deeply embedded in Roman entertainment and culture, come to be? Its early origins trace back to funeral rites, a tradition steeped in religious significance. The first gladiatorial games were organized not to entertain, but to honor the dead, particularly powerful Roman elites. They became a form of political theater, a means by which politicians— initially, most gladiators were prisoners of war, slaves, or criminals— sentenced to fight as a form of punishment, or to pay for their misdeeds. These men had little choice in the matter, condemned to fight to the death, often with little training, as part of a larger religious or punitive event. Emperors and politicians began to see the gladiatorial games as an opportunity to manipulate the mass. His sponsorship of games was a demonstration of his ability to provide for the people, securing their loyalty and trust. The masses could take refuge in the games, cheering for their favorite gladiators and forgetting, if only for a few hours, the hardships of their daily lives. The games became a spectacle designed not just to entertain, but to pacify, a tool used by the rulers to maintain control over a restless population. Emperor Nero saw the games as a way to solidify his authority and reinforce his image as both ruler and protector of the people. The more extravagant the games, the more favor the emperor could earn from the public, whose loyalty was often swayed by the thrill of the arena. They were a reflection of the contradictions that lay at the heart of the Roman Empire. A civilization that valued strength, honor, and public spectacle while simultaneously maintaining a brutal and exploitative system. The gladiators themselves embodied this tension. They were both heroes and victims, symbols of Roman might and human endurance, yet bound by the chains of servitude and spectacle. By sponsoring lavish events, they could curry favor with the public, distracting them from political discontent and consolidating their own power. From their beginnings as a religious rite to their evolution as political tools, yet their story is not just one of victory and fame. It is a story of survival, sacrifice, and the brutal realities of where men were turned into symbols immortalized in history, but forever bound by the arena's blood-soaked sands. And entertainment spectacles. The gladiator's role in Roman culture was shaped by a mixture of ritual, power, and performance. The gladiators' fame, though celebrated, was also a reminder of their status as slaves consumed by the very system that made them legends. Gladiators, once mere slaves or prisoners, now played a significant role in the emperor's public relations strategy. Gladiators, once religious offerings to appease the gods, became instruments of political power and symbols of Roman virtue. They were transformed from marginalized figures into central figures in the culture of the empire, their lives and deaths etched into the public consciousness. Yet, over time, a new class of gladiators emerged. The voluntary gladiators. Men who, rather than being forced into the arena, chose to fight for fame, wealth, or the possibility of gaining their freedom. There were objects of admiration and affection in the arena, but they were still bound to a brutal system that treated them as little more than tools for entertainment. The gladiators, though they may have gained renown, were still slaves to the empire, prisoners of their own success, trapped in the cycle of violence and performance. And emperors could manipulate the public's emotions, distract them from societal issues, and reinforce the perception of Roman might. Their rise to fame, as much as it may have provided them with temporary glory, could never shield them from the darker reality of their position in Roman society. The public nature of these games, held in grand arenas, often with hundreds or even thousands of spectators, meant that they were no longer confined to private funeral rituals, but were now an integral part of Roman social life. They were celebrations of the empire's strength, its reach, and its unyielding dominance over life and death. These early contests were not a celebration of violence, but a solemn offering made to appease the gods and ensure the safe passage of souls into the afterlife. The fight itself symbolized the conflict between life and death, a powerful metaphor for the Roman belief in sacrifice and remembrance. The arena became their stage, and the bloodshed a means to achieve something far greater than just survival. These gladiators, especially the famous ones, became symbols of the empire's values: honor, resilience, and, at times, a defiant will to survive against all odds. Was it simply a savage form of punishment for the defeated, a display of dominance over conquered enemies? Or did it evolve into something far more elaborate and essential part of the fabric of Roman society? The answers are not clear. The transition from funeral rites to public spectacle was not sudden. Rather, it was an evolution of the concept as Roman society grew more complex and its rulers more ambitious. Gladiatorial combat evolved into a way for the ruling class to display power, wealth, and control, an opportunity to entertain the masses, while solidifying their authority. Much like the gladiators who fought for their lives, the origins of the games are wrapped in layers of history, each revealing a different facet of Roman values, religion, politics, and social structure. At its core, gladiatorial combat was not initially conceived as the grand spectacle we recognize today. Over time, however, this religious tradition was co-opted into something far more political and by the time of the Roman Republic and later the Empire, gladiatorial games had become far more than mere religious observances. As the games evolved, so did the role of the gladiators themselves. The very act of fighting in the arena, whether for survival or for the promise of riches and recognition, transformed these men into icons. As gladiatorial combat became more ingrained in Roman society, its use as a political tool grew more pronounced. Emperor Augustus, for instance, used gladiatorial games as a means to display his wealth and power to the Roman populace. At the same time, these gladiatorial events served as a distraction from the darker undercurrents of Roman society: political unrest, social inequality, and the brutalities of empire. The journey of gladiatorial games from solemn funeral rites to imperial entertainment is a reflection of the broader evolution of Roman society. Despite their growing fame, however, the gladiators' existence remained a paradox. While the games themselves became more politically sophisticated, offering emperors the opportunity to manipulate public opinion, the gladiators who fought in the arena remained shackled to their fates. The gladiatorial games, as a cultural institution, were never simple. The mystery of gladiatorial origins lies not just in the rituals of the past, but in the complex relationship between the fighters, the games, and the empire itself. Today, the legacy of the gladiators is remembered as one of the most iconic aspects of ancient Roman culture. At the dawn of gladiatorial combat in ancient Rome, the tradition was far removed from the grand spectacles we recognize today. Initially, gladiatorial combat was deeply tied to Roman funeral rites, a solemn and religious ceremony designed not to entertain, but to honor the dead and appease the gods. The first recorded gladiatorial games, held in 264 BCE, were a direct manifestation of this ritual. The event was organized by Marcus Fulvius, a Roman nobleman, as part of the funeral rites for his father. The gladiators themselves, often slaves or captured enemies, fought to the death, not for the thrill of battle, but because they were seen as the ultimate offering to the gods. The sacred nature of the event gradually gave way to the spectacle, and the political and social dimensions of the games began to emerge. In a way, their sacrifice in the arena was believed to play a role in ensuring that the soul of the deceased would be properly guided to the afterlife. While initially reserved for funerary rituals, the games began to evolve into a form of public entertainment. Wealthy Romans, and, eventually, emperors saw the potential of these spectacles to serve not only as a way to honor the gods, but also as a method for consolidating power and manipulating public opinion. The emperor's sponsorship of the games became a critical component of Roman imperial politics. The games, now detached from the funeral rites that birthed them, had grown into the ultimate expression of imperial dominance, and so, central to Roman public life, that Roman identity was tied to the grandeur of these spectacles. The opening of the Colosseum in 80 CE, for instance, marked a key moment in the evolution of the gladiator games. Titus celebrated the completion of the Colosseum with an unprecedented 100-day series of games, involving not only gladiators but also naval battles and animal hunts. This was no longer a mere ritual. It had become an extravagant political. What began as a religious sacrificial act in the context of funeral rites grew into something far more complex. The games evolved from a modest display into lavish imperial spectacles, used by emperors to demonstrate their wealth, strength, and control over the empire. An social event designed to showcase the emperor's wealth and generosity. while solidifying his connection with the people. And courage, yet still bound by the chains of the very system that had created them. The gladiators, despite their fame, were tools in this larger political machine, and their stories, as thrilling as they might be, were ultimately written by the hand of Rome's rulers, who understood the value of spectacle in shaping the empire's legacy. The games were no longer just about honoring the dead. They became a way for the Roman elite to control them, manipulate public sentiment, and solidify their dominance over the empire. Gladiators were no longer seen solely as sacrifices but as performance symbols of power whose life or death struggles in the arena were designed to glorify the empire and its rulers. Grieving his loss, Fulvius sought to perform a grand gesture to ensure his father's soul would find peace in the afterlife, and in the process. These events were held in the grandest venues, such as the newly constructed amphitheaters, including the Colosseum in Rome. Though they gained fame, wealth, and even, in rare cases, their freedom, they remained pawns in a larger game, subject to the whims of the emperor, the crowds, and the system that had created them. Famous gladiators, those who won the crowd's favor, were viewed as representations of Roman resilience, bravery, and strength. The games, over time, became the arena for political statements, with emperors using the spectacle to consolidate their reign and portray their military and social might. The gladiators, as the fighters in this brutal contest, embodied the might of Rome. The games were carefully crafted to showcase Roman superiority, and gladiators were the stars of this grand theater. What had begun as a ritual offering for the deceased was now a spectacle designed to serve the emperor's agenda. The Roman elite, including senators, politicians, and wealthy patrons, quickly understood the value of associating themselves with these events. Gladiators, once mere slaves or prisoners, became symbols of Roman virility and strength. These public displays of combat were not only to honor the gods, but also to demonstrate Roman superiority in the face of foreign enemies and internal instability. The games became a political tool, allowing emperors to distract the population from the political unrest or economic difficulties they may have been facing. He initiated a new cultural practice that would eventually grow into one of the most iconic aspects of Roman entertainment. By sponsoring extravagant events, emperors could gain the loyalty of the people, ensuring their favor and support. The games allowed emperors to display their wealth, generosity, and strength, while simultaneously ensuring the populace's loyalty through distraction. The famous gladiators who emerged from these games became symbols of imperial power, their victories carefully constructed as part of the emperor's narrative of strength, victory, and dominance. Fulvius arranged for a fight between 3 pairs of gladiators, an event that would shape the future of the games. These gladiators, likely slaves or prisoners of war, were not simply fighters, they were offerings. The combat was not performed to entertain the public, but as a ritual act. Each blow struck in the arena was seen as a form of sacrifice, an act of honor to the deceased. The fighters were not there to win or perform for the audience. They were fulfilling a sacred role in a larger ritual designed to appease the gods and ensure a favorable afterlife for the departed. In these early days, gladiatorial combat was deeply interwoven with religion and respect for the dead. These rituals were intended to honor the deceased in the grandest way possible. The more elaborate the display, often involving multiple pairs of gladiators, the more favorably the gods would view the deceased, ensuring that their soul would safely pass into the afterlife. This connection to the sacred transformed the games into a form of public sacrifice, where the gladiators were not merely tools for entertainment but spiritual instruments in the eyes of Roman society. This initial form of gladiatorial combat had little to do with victory or entertainment. It was about honoring the fallen, not winning the crowd's favor. This sacrificial aspect of the games endured throughout the early years, but it would eventually shift as the games grew more popular and began to take on a more publicly entertaining role. As Roman society expanded, the gladiatorial games were increasingly used as tools of political power. By the time of Emperor Augustus, gladiatorial contests had expanded from funerary rites to mass public spectacles. Emperors understood the value of using the games to project their authority, offer charity to the people, and distract from political or economic problems. Over time, gladiatorial combat grew less about religious observance and more about imperial spectacle. The shift from a sacred ritual to a form of public entertainment was a reflection of the evolution of Roman politics. By the time of Emperor Titus, gladiatorial games had become so large in scale. By now, gladiators were no longer mere objects of sacrifice. They had become tools of political propaganda. The emperor's power was not only demonstrated through victories on the battlefield, but through the control of the gladiatorial games. While the games continued to serve a political purpose, the gladiators themselves remained trapped in a system that saw them as little more than commodities. The gladiatorial games, born from the need to honor the dead, transformed over time into a political tool, an entertainment spectacle, and a symbol of Roman might. Gladiators, once victims of circumstance, became the symbols of imperial power, their names etched into the annals of history, immortalized for their strength. Though the games were an essential part of Roman life, they were ultimately about power, political power, social control, and imperial spectacle. With the rise of the Roman Empire, the gladiatorial games grew from small, localized affairs into grand, meticulously organized spectacles that became a cornerstone of Roman society. These events, initially held in modest venues, soon gave way to massive arenas such as the Colosseum, one of the most iconic symbols of Rome's power. It was here that the gladiatorial games fully embraced their political significance. The games, once focused on religious rites and honoring the dead, gradually evolved into a tool for emperors to consolidate their power, entertain the masses, and control the populace. By the time of the emperors, gladiatorial contests were no longer just about spectacle. They were essential to maintaining political power and exerting influence over the people. In the context of imperial propaganda, they were symbols of Roman strength, discipline, and dominance. Each gladiatorial contest was not just a fight for survival, but a performance designed to reinforce the emperor's ideals. Emperor Trajan, for instance, organized the Trigenic Games in 107 CE to celebrate his victory in the Dacian Wars. These games, like many others, were more than just entertainment. They were a means of reaffirming the emperor's authority and celebrating Rome's military prowess. The games evolved from being isolated events tied to funerals or political celebrations into massive, state-sponsored spectacles that were regularly staged to commemorate military victories, the emperor's birthday, or other important events. These events allowed the emperor to convey a message that he was the ultimate authority in Rome, able to command the lives of those within his empire, even in the most brutal of contexts. Gladiators in these games were not only symbols of individual bravery, but also representations of imperial might. These hunts often featured exotic animals brought from across the empire, which the emperor could demonstrate his dominion over. Gladiators who survived many battles and won the favor of the crowd could come to symbolize the imperial power that sponsored them. While Spartacus's legacy was defined by his revolt against Rome, he was also seen as an embodiment of Roman values. The games were no longer merely a form of entertainment, they had become an essential means of pacification. Emperors and politicians knew that the games had the power to distract the populace from the empire's deeper issues: social inequality, political instability, and the undercurrents of discontent that could undermine their authority. The emperors quickly realized the power of these games to sway public opinion, reinforce political power, and demonstrate their dominance over life and death. The gladiators who fought in these games, despite their fame and adoration, remained at the mercy of a system that used their victories to maintain the emperor's grip on Rome. The arena, for all its grandeur, was still a political stage, and the gladiators, no matter how famous they became, were always part of the emperor's larger narrative of strength, discipline, and control. Gladiators, once nothing more than slaves or criminals, became symbols of Roman strength, living tools of political propaganda used to bolster the emperor's image and ensure the loyalty of the people. By hosting these grand displays, emperors could temporarily shift the focus of the people from their everyday struggles to the excitement and drama of the arena. His battle for freedom and his ability to inspire other slaves to rise up against their oppressors was an ironic reflection of the empire's sense of imperial strength. In the case of Spartacus, was turned against the empire itself. For many Romans, his story was not one of defeat, but a reminder of the power and resilience of the Roman system that had both created him and sought to destroy him. A famous gladiator could be used as a living testament to Roman values, the embodiment of the glory of Rome. These massive, staged events not only served to distract the populace, but to reinforce the emperor's control over their lives. Using entertainment as a form of social control, the games became a way to keep the masses docile, entertained, and distracted from the political realities that might undermine the emperor's rule. Such events were also used to symbolize Rome as conquered territories. Animals represented the lands brought into the empire, and their defeat in the arena mirrored Rome's military victories. The excitement and the brutality of the contests gave the common people a chance to experience intense emotions, a feeling of communal joy and relief from the stresses of their lives. This ritual of violent entertainment became a critical element in maintaining imperial stability. By providing the people with this outlet, emperors ensured that the masses remained placated, distracted, and, most importantly, loyal to their rulers. The public, in turn, saw these grand spectacles as proof of Roman superiority and the emperor's ability to bring the farthest reaches of the empire to heel. The games, in this sense, were a metaphor for Roman power, a demonstration of the state's ability to control life and death, even in the form of brutal human combat, but of the very qualities that Rome prided itself on: strength, honor, bravery, and resilience. Their fame was tied directly to the political agendas of the time, often reflecting the virtues that the emperor wished to project. The games became a means of pacifying the masses, offering them a temporary escape from the harsh realities of daily life, including poverty, political instability, and social unrest. Famous gladiators were no longer simply celebrated for their skill in the arena. They became living representations of the empire's ideals. A gladiator's rise to fame was often entwined with the political interests of the emperor and the ruling elite. These fighters, who once might have been slaves or criminals, could be elevated to symbols of imperial power. Their victories in the arena were not just personal triumphs. They were seen as embodiments of Roman resilience, and their fame was used to promote the emperor's strength and the glory of the Roman state. To mark the completion of the grand amphitheater, Titus hosted a series of games that would become legendary in Roman history. These games lasted for 100 days, a period filled with an extravaganza of events ranging from gladiator combat to mock naval battles. The more famous a gladiator became, the more his success could be used to underline the idea that the emperor controlled victory and defeat in both the physical and political arenas. Gladiators were reshaped into imperial icons, carefully curated to fit the emperor's narrative of Roman superiority. This was not merely a celebration of the building itself. It was a demonstration of the emperor's power, wealth, and generosity toward the people. A day at the Colosseum, with its lavish displays of combat, provided a rare opportunity for the Roman people to experience exhilaration and entertainment. It was a brief respite from their struggles, a diversion carefully orchestrated by the ruling elite to ensure their continued support. One of the most striking examples of the political power of the games came during the reign of Emperor Titus, who inaugurated the Colosseum in 80. The games Titus hosted were designed to achieve several political objectives. First, they provided a display of imperial largesse, as Titus generously sponsored the event at his own expense. By doing so, he gained the admiration of the Roman populace, many of whom were living in difficult economic conditions. The games allowed Titus to present himself as both a benevolent ruler and a strong emperor, capable of offering entertainment and stability to the mass. The gladiators who fought during these grand spectacles were not merely participants in violent combat. As the gladiatorial games grew in scale and significance, the fame of individual gladiators also began to take on new political dimensions. The larger and more elaborate the spectacle, the more the emperor could use it to cement his position of power. For the emperor, the games became an important political tool. The sheer scale of gladiatorial spectacles in Rome became a way for emperors to demonstrate their absolute control over the empire. For example, the Venetians' animal hunts that were part of the gladiatorial games were carefully controlled performances where the emperor could showcase his wealth and power over both animals and men. Even the very structure of the Colosseum, with its 50,000-seat capacity, was a testament to the imperial grandeur and the power that the emperor wielded over both people and the state. As the gladiatorial games became more entrenched in Roman society, famous gladiators began to emerge as symbols not only of individual prowess. These gladiators were often used to emphasize the Roman ideal of virtues, the quality that defined Roman men as brave, capable, and loyal to the state. Take, for example, Spartacus, the gladiator who became a symbol of resistance and rebellion. As gladiatorial spectacles grew in scale, so too did their political significance. In the Roman worldview, the games offered catharsis, a release of tension and frustration. The gladiatorial games in Rome evolved from humble religious rituals into grand political spectacles that served a dual purpose: to entertain and to control. By transforming the games into grand spectacles, the emperors wielded them as a tool to pacify the mass, distract them from the difficulties of their daily lives, and consolidate power. The gladiators who stepped into the arena to fight for the amusement of the Roman public were often as mysterious and multifaceted as the very origins of the gladiatorial games themselves. Who were these men, willing to risk their lives in brutal combat, sometimes to the death, for the crowd's pleasure? In the early days of the gladiatorial tradition, these fighters were primarily slaves, prisoners of war, and criminals often forced into the arena against their will. Yet, as time passed, the nature of gladiatorial combat began to shift, and the profiles of the men who fought in the arena became more diverse. For many of the poor and disenfranchised, the games represented the only possible route out of destitution. The fame that came with being a gladiator could result in wealth, sponsorship from powerful patrons, and even a measure of respect in Roman society, something that was otherwise out of reach for many common men. Gladiators who fought well and survived long enough could secure their freedom, a tantalizing hope for those trapped in poverty or servitude. While many gladiators remained enslaved or incarcerated, others made the conscious decision to embrace this brutal life, drawn by the allure of fame, wealth, and the possibility of freedom. These men, captured during Rome's conquests, were often given little more than the choice to fight or die. For some slaves and prisoners, the hope of earning the rudis, the wooden sword that symbolized a gladiator's release from servitude, was the only thing that kept them fighting. The rudis was more a symbol of Roman generosity than an actual guarantee of freedom. Many gladiators, especially those who had spent years in the arena, found it difficult to adjust to life outside of the ludi. These men had fought for their countries, their cities, and their homes, only to be thrown into the arena to fight for the amusement of a foreign empire. The humiliation of being forced to fight in the arena was immense, stripping away their identity as warriors and replacing it with the role of an entertainer, a brutal form of punishment for the conquered. Their bodies were battered and broken, their spirits worn down by the violence of the arena. They were both heroes and victims, symbols of Roman strength, yet often powerless within the system that glorified their struggles. The very skills that had once made them proud soldiers, whether as foot soldiers, cavalry, or archers, were twisted into performance. Though they may have fought heroically, they were rarely remembered as individuals. Each had his own reasons for fighting, but they were all bound by the same system. A system that saw them as tools of entertainment, regardless of their origins. The life of a gladiator was brutal, often short, and frequently devoid of choice. Even those who volunteered for the honor and promise of fame were ultimately trapped in a system that saw them as expendable. For those forced into the arena, the hope of freedom was often as elusive as the victory they fought for. Their fates, regardless of their skill or bravery, were dictated by forces far beyond their control, and the gladiators who once fought for their lives were often forgotten in the wake of the empire's grandeur. Instead, they were reduced to representations of Rome's power over the their identity swallowed by the spectacle that had taken their lives. The discipline and bravery they had learned in their own lands were recontextualized for the amusement of the Roman people. No longer were they fighting for freedom or glory, they were fighting simply to survive in a world that had reduced them to mere tools of entertainment. What they had once dreamed of as freedom had, for many, become an empty promise of life outside the arena that was often as difficult as the one they had fought to escape. The emperor or a wealthy patron might choose to release a gladiator who had earned their favor, but that was an uncertain and often arbitrary process. For many, their fame or survival in the arena was not enough to grant them freedom. Instead, they remained bound to their masters, trapped in a system that saw them only as performers, no different from the swords and shields they wielded. The rudis was a rare prize, awarded to those who had fought valiantly and survived long enough to prove their worth. It represented the chance to leave behind the arena and live as a free man, outside the chains of slavery or servitude. Their identity as warriors, once honored in their homelands, was stripped away as they were paraded before the crowds in chains, forced to do battle for the amusement of the Roman public. To them, the arena was not a stage for heroism, but a reminder of their subjugation, the loss of their former roles as warriors, now reduced to mere objects of entertainment. For those who succeeded in the games, the rewards could be great. Slaves, captured prisoners of war, and criminals were forced into the gladiatorial life, coerced into combat with no chance of escape. These men had no say in the matter. They were owned, their fate determined by the whims of their masters. Whether those masters were the wealthy, patrons who controlled gladiatorial schools, or the politicians and emperors who owned them. Fame, the potential for freedom, and the adoration of the masses were the prizes for a gladiator who was able to endure the brutal battles. Roman society had a ruthless system of slavery, and gladiators were often the property of their owners, who saw them not as human beings, but as tools of combat to be used for entertainment, profit, or political gain. For these men, the arena was not a choice, it was their fate. However, for many, this dream of glory and freedom was fleeting. The motivations behind a man's decision to become a gladiator were not uniform, nor were they straightforward. Some, especially those who volunteered for the fight, did so to improve their status, escape the crushing weight of poverty, or achieve glory and recognition. For others, gladiatorial combat was a harsh form of punishment, stripping away their identity and dignity, forcing them to fight for their lives in the blood-soaked sands of the arena. The training was grueling, often pushing these men to the brink of exhaustion, teaching them to fight with precision, discipline, and brutal efficiency. Their bodies were conditioned for combat, but their minds were trained for survival. Every fight was a test of endurance, strength, and willpower. While some gladiators gained fame and the potential for a reward, most slaves fought with no such hope. Their future was grim, a never-ending cycle of violence and servitude, where survival in the arena was often their only chance at life. These gladiators were not just combatants, they were symbols of Roman power, often coerced or manipulated into servitude for the sake of public entertainment. In the early years, the idea of a voluntary gladiator might have seemed like a paradox. Why would anyone choose to fight in the arena, especially when death loomed so closely in every contest? Yet, over time, many men volunteered to fight for the gladiatorial schools, known as lut. These men, called octorati, were not slaves or prisoners. They were individuals who made a conscious decision to enter this brutal world. While some volunteered out of desperation, seeking to escape the poverty and hardships of their lives, others were drawn to the idea of fame and the possibility of being elevated from obscurity to prominence. The decision to become a gladiator was not a light one, and it was often motivated by a desire for social mobility. Gladiators like Spartacus likely saw the potential for a better life in the arena, where he could use his skills as a fighter to carve out a place of his own. For the vast majority of gladiators, the path to the arena was not a voluntary one. Slaves who were trained as gladiators were often taken from the dungeons of war, prisoners who had been captured in battle and sold into gladiatorial training. The life of a gladiator slave was brutal and exhausting. For the prisoners of war, their fate was equally grim. Perhaps the most tantalizing and cruel aspect of the gladiatorial life was the possibility of freedom. Yet, for most gladiators, this hope remained distant and unfulfilled. Even for those who managed to survive long enough to earn their rudies, the freedom they gained was bittersweet. Perhaps the most tragic category of gladiators were the prisoners of war, men who had once been warriors in their own right, only to find themselves captured and reduced to spectacle. For prisoners of war, the arena was a stage for survival, but it was also a place of deep identity loss. Their stories are often overlooked, as their names were lost in the sands of time. The gladiators who entered the arena were diverse slaves, prisoners of war, criminals, and volunteers. In the end, the mystery of the gladiators lies not just in who they were, but in the contradictory nature of their existence. The role of the gladiator in Roman society was a paradox, a figure who, despite being revered for his strength, bravery, and valor, was simultaneously bound to a life of subjugation and exploitation. The public adored them for their displays of strength, courage, and skill. No matter how famous or beloved they became, they remained slaves or prisoners. The purpose of the games was clear: to entertain, to provide a form of catharsis for the Roman people, and to demonstrate the power of the emperor. Though they might have enjoyed fleeting moments of adoration from the crowd, their true identity as slaves or prisoners was never forgotten. On the surface, their fame and the thrill of victory might have appeared to provide a sense of achievement, but beneath that exterior was a deep-seated resentment, confusion, and despair. Gladiators, even those who gained fame, lived in constant awareness of their situation. Yet, this hope was often elusive. Few gladiators actually earned their freedom in this way. Even those who did often found that life outside the arena was not as liberating as they had imagined. Many gladiators, especially those who had spent years in combat, found it difficult to transition to normal life. The emotional and physical scars of their years in the arena were too great to overcome, and even with the rudies in hand, they were still trapped by their pasts. The very qualities that made them famous, bravery, strength, and resilience, were ultimately the tools that kept them tied to a life of servitude. They fought not just for the applause of the crowd, but for their survival in a system that controlled every aspect of their lives. Their fame, as powerful as it was, could never fully shield them from the reality that they were slaves, prisoners, or victims of an empire that viewed them as mere entertainment. They were fighting not just for victory but for survival, and often their lives were governed by the demands of their masters, or the emperor. On one hand, they were revered for their strength and bravery, celebrated as symbols of Roman ideals. On the other, they were slaves, or prisoners, bound to the arena and subject to the whims of their masters. Gladiators lived in a constant state of conflict, fighting not only for survival in the arena but for the possibility of freedom and dignity. Fame, though it offered temporary solace, could never fully free them from the system that had created them. They fought not for their own reasons, but for the entertainment of others. For the gladiators, survival was not just about winning in the arena, it was about enduring the crushing weight of a life defined by performance, by the expectation of the masses, and by the deep desire for freedom that could only be fleeting. The paradox of their fame being both celebrated and one of the most enduring and tragic aspects of their existence. Their self-worth was defined not by their own desires or goals, but by their ability to please the crowd. A gladiator could rise to fame in the arena, his name could become known across the empire, and his victories could make him a hero to the people. However, this fame did not equate to freedom. For most gladiators, their lives were governed by the whims of their patrons, and their status was always precarious. The adoration of the crowds, while intoxicating, was always at the mercy of the emperor, the wealthy sponsors, and the crowd's fickle tastes. In the end, fame and freedom were often illusions that distracted gladiators from the true cost of their existence. Gladiators were defined by their role as fighters, and in this, they lost their sense of who they truly were. The identity of a gladiator was bound to their status as slaves, as tools of spectacle, as performers. The applause they received was not for them as individuals but for the performance they provided. They lived in constant fear of losing their status, of being discarded for a younger, stronger fighter, or of dying in battle. The mental strain of knowing that every fight could be their last, coupled with the emotional toll of knowing they were never truly free, led to a profound sense of despair for many. Even those who gained fame, money, or a degree of respect were still, at their core, trapped in a system that reduced them to mere tools of entertainment. But none of these things could erase the fundamental truth of their lives. They were owned by someone else. No matter how many victories they won, no matter how many adoring crowds cheered their name, they were still slaves, unable to control their own destinies. Their battles, while fiercely fought, were not just physical but also psychological. To be a gladiator meant constantly battling against the oppressive forces that controlled their lives. Even the most successful gladiators could never fully escape this. This sense of being reduced to an object for public consumption was deeply troubling. Gladiators were not celebrated as individuals with hopes, dreams, or ambitions. They were simply tools in a larger system of entertainment that existed to benefit the powerful. Gladiators were no different from the lions or the exotic animals that were part of the spectacle. They were part of the entertainment machine that the emperor and the wealthy elite controlled. Their physical prowess and bravery were showcased for the public's amusement, and the bloodshed they endured was part of a broader political and social agenda designed to solidify the emperor's power. The gladiators were under the complete control of their patrons, who owned them and dictated their fates. The rudes, a wooden sword awarded to gladiators who had performed valiantly in the arena, became a symbol of hope. This symbol of freedom promised a possibility of liberasana, chance to leave behind the life of bloodshed and servitude. Gladiators who earned the rudes were often given a modicum of respect and were granted their freedom. However, for most, this was nothing more than a distant dream. Their lives were at the mercy of their masters, the emperor, and the whims of the crowd. No matter how many victories they achieved, no matter how adored they became, they could never escape the fundamental truth of their existence. They were property fighting for survival, not just against their opponents in the arena, but against the very system that controlled their lives. Gladiators could become symbols of Roman virtues. They were admired for their ability to survive brutal combat, and their willingness to fight for the entertainment of the masses. Their names would echo across the empire, with spectators chanting their names and celebrating their feats. Some gladiators became heroes in the eyes of the public, their faces immortalized on statues and coins, and their stories recounted with reverence. Gladiators could rise to fame, even becoming beloved figures in Roman culture, but their status as slaves or prisoners was never fully erased. Though they might be celebrated in the Colosseum or through the stories of their triumphs, they remained inescapably trapped within a system that valued them only for their utility as entertainment. Their battles were fought not only in the arena but in the mental and emotional confines of their very existence. In many ways, The gladiator was a living contradiction. However, this fame and adoration existed alongside the reality of their status. At the heart of the gladiator's paradox was their role as objects of entertainment. For the gladiator, this was an emotionally devastating reality. The mental and emotional toll of being a gladiator was immense. Famous gladiators could gain material rewards, luxuries, money, and even land. The idea of freedom became central to the emotional landscape of a gladiator. The rudes symbolized more than just physical freedom. It represented the hope that one could escape the cycle of violence, become human again, and live a life outside of the arena. One of the most profound aspects of a gladiator's life was the loss of personal identity. Even the most famous gladiators, those who had risen above the crowds to become legends, were not immune to the emotional weight of this reality. Fame and freedom were interwoven in the gladiator's life, but they were often fleeting. Even the greatest gladiators could find themselves trapped by their own success. The gladiators' role in Roman society was characterized by a profound duality. Their journey was marked by both adulation and subjugation, and the psychological and emotional toll of their lives was immense. The history of gladiatorial combat is a vivid reflection of Rome's growth as an empire and its transformation from a modest religious ritual to a grand political spectacle reveals much about the shifting values and power dynamics of Roman society. The first recorded gladiatorial contest was organized by Marcus Fulvius as part of his father's funeral. As the centuries passed, the connection between the games and funerary rituals gradually began to diminish, and the games transformed into public events, now held on a much larger scale. They evolved from small, localized events to lavish spectacles in grand amphitheaters, culminating in the massive shows hosted in the iconic Colosseum. The idea was simple: to ensure the safe passage of the deceased's soul. The combatants, typically slaves or prisoners, fought in a ritualistic display. They were a way for emperors to demonstrate their wealth and generosity to the Roman citizens, a form of public charity that strengthened their image as leaders capable of providing for the people. Emperor Titus, for example, commemorated the opening of the Colosseum in 80 CE with a 100-day festival of gladiatorial combats, animal hunts, and mock naval battles. By hosting such an extravagant display, Titus demonstrated his strength, not only in the military realm, but also in his ability to command the loyalty and admiration of the mass. The games were a way to distract the people from the difficulties of daily life: poverty, political unrest, and social turmoil. By casting them in the role of Roman warriors, even the most oppressed gladiators could become representations of the empire's virtues. Gladiators who displayed exceptional skill or bravery in the arena could be awarded rewards, including money, land, or, in some rare cases, their freedom. These rewards were used by the emperor and the ruling class as ways to keep the gladiators loyal and dependent on their master, reinforcing the notion that their lives and their victories were ultimately in service to the empire. The games, with their grand displays and lavish expenses, were also a symbol of Roman military power, showing the empire's ability to control life and death. As the games became an important part of the political and social fabric of Rome, they also became more elaborate and lavish. Gladiators, though slaves or prisoners, were paraded as symbols of Roman virtues, living representations of the empire's unyielding might. Gladiators were no longer just fighters. They were instruments of imperial propaganda, warriors who fought not only for their survival but for the emperor's image. In this way, the gladiatorial games evolved from humble beginnings into a grand, all-encompassing political tool that reinforced the Roman ideals of power, strength, and dominance. The spectacle of the gladiatorial contests became a form of public appeasement, a means to pacify the masses and ensure the loyalty of the people. Gladiators were heroes and victims, trapped in a system that used them to reinforce the emperor's narrative of power. Ultimately, the evolution of gladiatorial combat from religious ritual to imperial propaganda reflects the changing nature of Roman politics, where entertainment and control were seamlessly intertwined. As the games evolved, they became intertwined with the narrative of imperial dominance, highlighting the emperor's absolute control over his subjects, his power over life and death, and his ability to shape public opinion through entertainment. What began as a humble religious ceremony evolved into a massive spectacle designed to consolidate the emperor's control and influence over the Roman people. Gladiators, once victims of their circumstances, became symbols of Roman might, manipulated by the ruling elite for the benefit of the state. Their victories in the arena were not just personal triumphs, they were extensions of imperial power, reinforcing the idea that the emperor had control over life and death, both in the arena and throughout the empire. The shift in the game's purpose from religious ceremony to imperial entertainment of gladiators, once sacrificial figures, were now tools of the empire. The Roman Empire, especially at its height, was a vast and diverse empire, comprising millions of people from different cultures, backgrounds, and religions. Political instability, social unrest, and economic hardship were persistent threats to imperial authority. The games provided an outlet for the people's frustration, a way to distract them from the injustices or inequalities they faced in their daily lives. Gladiators, once mere objects of religious sacrifice, now became living symbols of imperial authority. Their victories in the arena, a metaphor for Roman superiority and military might. Gladiators, in their bloody contests, became the spectacle that allowed the people to release their tension, and the emperor used this release to reinforce his control. The games, as a form of entertainment, provided catharsis, emotional purging of pent-up feelings of frustration or anger. In return, the people were loyal, appeased by the grandeur of the spectacle. Gladiators were the tools of this catharsis, the performers who carried the weight of the empire's social control. The games symbolized the ultimate control of the emperor, the ability to command life and death at will, even in the most visceral and brutal form. They became public performers, symbols of strength and courage, in a world that was now using them as instruments of entertainment and political propaganda. It was a sacred event, not for entertainment, but for the spiritual well-being of the deceased and their family. These men, once slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals, were transformed from victims of circumstance into symbols of Roman power. Their very survival and success in the arena were reframed as representations of Roman courage, discipline, and resilience. The emperor's ability to present such figures to the public reaffirmed his strength and his control over life and death. Gladiators, often regarded as sacrificial figures, fought not for the pleasure of the crowd, but to carry out the solemn duty of pleasing the gods. A gladiator's victory in the arena wasn't simply a personal triumph, it was an extension of the emperor's power. The crowd's adoration of these men was part of a larger narrative, carefully curated by the emperor and the ruling class, designed to reinforce Roman superiority both on and off the battlefield. The games evolved from their initial purpose, the dead, into an indispensable tool of political control that both symbolized and reinforced the dominance of the Roman Empire. Gladiators, once mere sacrifices in service to religious rites, became icons of Roman power, manipulated and paraded for the benefit of the ruling class, the emperors, and the political elite. The games, originally designed to honor the dead, now became a public spectacle used by the ruling elite to assert their control, power, and wealth. Emperors and politicians recognized the potential of the gladiatorial games to serve not only as entertainment but as propaganda, tools used to reinforce the emperor's dominance and secure loyalty from the people. The gladiatorial games began in 264 BCE as a form of funeral rite, a religious ceremony designed to honor the dead and appease the gods. Initially, these games were connected to religious beliefs and funeral practices, demonstrating the significance of death and the passage into the afterlife. In this new context, gladiators were no longer simply sacrificial figures. With the rise of the Roman Empire, gladiatorial games became an essential part of the political machinery. The games served multiple purposes in this new political context. The more elaborate the games, the more the emperor could consolidate his power. As the gladiatorial games grew in significance, the gladiators themselves became integral to the political narrative of the Roman Empire. Famous gladiators, especially those who survived for long periods and achieved prominence, became living propaganda tools. While many gladiators were slaves, captured prisoners, or criminals, their transformation into heroes and icons in the eyes of the public showcased how the elite could manipulate these figures. Beyond their role as tools of political propaganda, the gladiatorial games were an effective method of pacifying the masses. By offering the games as a form of public entertainment, emperors could temporarily subdue the population. Spectators in the Colosseum, cheering and chanting for their favorite gladiators, were given a temporary sense of power and release from their own hardships. The transformation of gladiatorial combat from a sacred ritual to a political tool marked the growing influence of the Roman Empire. The imperial control over the gladiatorial games not only reflected the strength of the emperor but also reinforced the values of discipline and dominance. The public spectacle that began as a religious ritual to honor the dead became, in time, an essential part of the imperial agenda. The gladiatorial games were more than just a form of entertainment, they were a tool of political power. As the games grew, so did their importance to the Roman state. The enduring mystery of gladiatorial combat is not simply about its origins or the spectacle it became, but about the paradox of the gladiators' existence within Roman society. These men, celebrated for their unmatched strength, courage, and tenacity, were nevertheless slaves, bound to a life of servitude and exploitation. They were political tools, used by the emperor and the ruling elite to maintain control over the mass. They were religious symbols, representing the power of the gods and the will of Rome, and capture the adoration of the masses could still remain powerless within the very empire they served. The games were not just about brutality or spectacle. They were about how the Roman elite wielded power, used symbols to manipulate public perception, and controlled the masses through the promise of entertainment. The gladiators, both victims and heroes, embodied the tension between the Roman ideals of strength and freedom and the oppressive reality of life under imperial rule. These contradictions, at the heart of the gladiatorial games, reveal much about the nature of Roman society and its complex relationship with power, spectacle, and the human cost of empire. Despite their fame and accomplishments, they were never free. They were slaves, their status defined by the whims of their masters, their role reduced to that of mere entertainment. Even the rare gladiator who won his freedom through the rudes could not escape the emotional scars or the lingering shadow of the system that had shaped his life. And, most painfully, they were entertainers, reduced to performers who fought and died for the satisfaction of the crowd. Even as some gladiators achieved fame and admiration, they remained trapped in the arena, subject to the whims of their masters, the fickle tides of political favor, and the relentless demand for spectacle. And their stories remain a powerful reminder of the cost of entertainment and the price of glory. Their personal desires for freedom, respect, or dignity were often secondary to the needs of the empire and empire that viewed them as little more than pawns in its larger narrative of power and dominance. Despite their remarkable feats in the arena, they were reduced to objects of entertainment, their very humanity overshadowed by their roles as tools for public consumption. Their rise to fame, often a result of raw ability and determination, was significant, but it was also fragile. In a world where glory was fleeting, the gladiators' fame could disappear as quickly as it was earned, leaving them discarded for the next rising star from the ranks. At their core, gladiators were more than mere fighters. The mystery of gladiatorial combat lies not just in its origins, but in this contradiction at the heart of the gladiators' existence. How did a practice that began as a religious ritual, performed to honor the dead and appease the gods, evolve into a massive political spectacle designed to reinforce Roman authority? What began as a ceremonial act tied to funeral rites eventually became a tool for the emperor to demonstrate control over both life and death, using the games to maintain his power over the people. But the deeper mystery lies in how these gladiators, men who could rise to fame, conquer their enemies. The questions surrounding gladiatorial combat continue to resonate because they reflect the deeper complexities of Roman power and entertainment. Ultimately, the mystery of the gladiators lies in the paradox of their existence. They were both symbols of Roman virtue and tools of political control. One of the most striking aspects of the gladiatorial games was the contrast between the lives of the gladiators and the lives of the Roman elite. While gladiators were subjected to a brutal and often short existence fighting for survival in the arena, senators and wealthy elites lived in luxury, their lives defined by privilege, politics, and power. They became not only a form of entertainment for the masses, the games were also highly calculated political events, used strategically to maintain the emperor's authority and solidify power. The emperor's generosity in sponsoring these violent spectacles helped him garner the loyalty of the people, who would cheer and chant for their favorites in the arena. Though they were adored by the crowd, their roles were not as personal. Heroes, they were tools in the emperor's game of public manipulation. Their fame and victories were not only a source of excitement, but a means to reinforce the emperor's image as the central figure of Roman power. Gladiators, as symbols of strength and endurance, embodied the emperor's ideals of victory, resilience, and control. But in reality, they were bound by a system that kept them as slaves or prisoners, forced to perform for the satisfaction of the public. The elite understood that the games provided an emotional release for the people, a way to vent their frustrations and experience catharsis, without turning their anger toward the ruling class. By offering the games, the emperor could redirect the people's energy into something less dangerous, turning potential unrest into loyalty. The gladiators' pain, their sacrifice, was part of a larger political strategy to ensure the stability of the empire. This public favor was essential for maintaining the emperor's legitimacy, especially in a city as politically charged as Rome, and the inherent cruelty of an empire that thrived on the exploitation of both human and animal life. The gladiators, though famous and revered for their bravery, were always, at their core, victims living representations of an empire that controlled them for the benefit of its rulers. The gladiators embodied the Roman ideals of discipline, honor, resilience, and strength. But in the arena, these values were twisted into a form of entertainment, a way for the elite to demonstrate that they controlled not just the lives of the gladiators, but the very soul of the empire. And social order. The gladiators remained trapped in a system that valued their lives only for the spectacle they could provide. The Colosseum stood as a stark symbol of this disparity, a monument to imperial power that simultaneously celebrated the strength of Rome and exposed the deep inequalities at its heart. The games became a metaphor for the Roman state in which those who were oppressed, like the gladiators, were forced to perform for the amusement of the public, while the elite continued to control the machinery of empire. The elite was surrounded by luxury, sumptuous banquets, lavish homes, and an air of privilege that kept them above the daily struggles of the common people. Gladiators, though loved by the public, were ultimately pawns in the emperor's game of social control. They were manipulated and paraded for the benefit of the elite. Their struggles a means to maintain the emperor's dominance over both the arena and the people. Its grand architecture, a structure capable of holding tens of thousands of spectators, was a testament to the power and influence of the Roman Empire. It was not just a venue for games. It was a statement of imperial might, a physical representation of the emperor's ability to control the masses and put on an extravagant display of wealth and power. In contrast, the gladiators were forced to endure grueling training, physical punishment, and the constant threat of death. But for the gladiators, the Colosseum represented something far darker. It was a place of enslavement and suffering, where their bodies were turned into instruments of entertainment for the elite. The contrast between the luxurious lives of those in the emperor's box and the brutality of the gladiators' lives in the arena could not have been more pronounced. The elite could live a life of indulgence, while the gladiators existed in a world of violence and fear, their fates determined by the whims of those in power. The games were a distraction, but they were also a statement of power, a reminder that the emperor held control over life and death, not just in the arena, but throughout the empire. By offering the masses grand spectacles, emperors could distract the populace from the realities of political instability, social unrest, and economic hardship. The people, temporarily diverted by the excitement and violence of the arena, were pacified, their attention turned away from the inner workings of government and instead focused on the gladiators' battles. The Colosseum, standing proudly at the heart of the Roman Empire, represented the opulence and political might of the elite, while simultaneously serving as a stage for the suffering of the gladiators. These men, often enslaved or forced into battle, fought in the arena not just for their survival, but for the entertainment of a population largely unaware or, perhaps indifferent to, the cruelty of the system that controlled them. The stark disparity between these two groups reveals the deeper social inequalities of Roman society, as well as the way the gladiatorial games became a tool used to reinforce these divides. As the gladiatorial games evolved into grand spectacles held in iconic venues like the Colosseum, gladiatorial games were often advertised as acts of generosity and entertain men, a way for emperors to please the people and demonstrate their benevolence. The reality was far more complex. In a society where bread and circuses were the means to keep the masses content, the games became a tool of control. In this context, gladiators became pawns in the larger political theater. The lives of the rich and powerful, those who sat in the elite seats of the Colosseum, overseeing the events, were in sharp contrast to the gladiators fighting below. The Colosseum itself, the greatest symbol of Roman entertainment, served as a monument to the divide between the elite and the common people. For the mass, attending the games in the Colosseum was an opportunity to witness the grandeur of the emperor's reign, to cheer for their favorite gladiators and witness public executions, animal hunts, and mock naval battles. Beyond the spectacle, the gladiatorial games were also an effective form of social control. The games also emphasized Roman values, those qualities that the elite wished to project onto the mass. The gladiatorial games were not just a form of entertainment, they were an intricate political tool that reinforced the power dynamics of Roman society. As the games evolved, so did the divide between the elite and the common people. While the wealthy Roman elite lived in luxury, controlling the political ultimately, the games became an expression of Roman ideologia, display of the empire's military dominance. In ancient Rome, the gap between the gladiators and the elite was profound, a stark contrast in every aspect of their lives. While gladiators were confined to brutal, violent existences, the elite of Roman society lived lives of luxury and privilege. These men were free, their existence defined by wealth, family heritage, and the political maneuvering that kept them in power. Their status as free men was in stark contrast to the fate of the gladiators, who lived not only in constant fear of death, but also in deprivation and exploitation. They fought day after day, in the hope of surviving long enough to be awarded the rudis, the wooden sword that symbolized their freedom. They were not subjected to the whims of a cruel system that saw them as expendable. Their wealth and power were a result of their heritage, connections, and political savvy. Emperors and senators were born into their privileges, and even those who achieved power through military conquest or political maneuvering enjoyed a life of control over both people and resources. The Colosseum was not just a place for gladiatorial combat, it was a monument to imperial power and control. These seats were reserved for emperors, senators, and other members of the ruling class, providing them with an unchallenged view of their control over life and death. The Colosseum was quite literally a space where the rulers of Rome could assert their dominance. The emperors used the games to distract the people from the harsh realities of Roman life: social inequality, poverty, political unrest, by providing them with a grand, bloody spectacle. The gladiators' suffering became a spectacle that reinforced the hierarchy of Roman society, where the elite watched from above, their lives untouched by the brutality unfolding below. While the elite lived in luxury, controlled by political influence and wealth, the gladiators were trapped in a system of exploitation and brutality, forced to fight for the amusement of the public. The Colosseum stood as a physical representation of this divide, where the elite sat in opulence while the gladiators fought for survival. The gladiators, trapped in this violent system, became pawns in the larger game of imperial politics. Gladiators, despite their fame, were pawns in this larger narrative, their lives shaped by a system that controlled their bodies and their fates. In the end, the games were a display of the empire's power over both the living and the dead, and the stark contrast between the elite and the gladiators only emphasized the hierarchy that defined Roman society. While they fought and died for the entertainment of the people, the emperor, sitting comfortably in his elevated seat, used the games to reinforce his authority and to maintain control over the masses, showing that they had the power to both give life by granting freedom to gladiators who survived long enough, and take it away by ordering the death of those who failed to meet the expectations of the crowd. Its massive size, capable of holding up to 50,000 spectators, and demonstrated Rome's ability to control both its citizens and its entertainers. Yet, this hope was often a fleeting illusion. For the vast majority, the rudis was a dream that never materialized. The grueling training, the exhaustion, and the constant risk of death in the arena left many gladiators physically and emotionally scarred, their bodies often broken before they ever saw freedom. For the elite, however, the Colosseum was a symbol of their controller space, where they could assert their power over both the gladiators and the Roman people, creating a division between the rulers and the ruled. Was reflected in the very architecture of the arena. They were never free, and their identity was always tied to the role. They were forced to play the role of entertainment for the match. The luxury and comfort of the elite were worlds apart from the brutal realities faced by the gladiators in the arena, whose lives were controlled by their owners, and who fought not for personal glory but for mere survival. The aristocracy enjoyed magnificent homes adorned with frescoes, marble floors, and immaculate garden, symbols of wealth and social standing that reflected their position at the top of the Roman hierarchy. And he controlled not just the lives of the elite, but also the lives of the gladiators, who fought for the emperor's entertainment. Political maneuvering, not combat, determined their place in Roman society. They were not bound to a life of violent performance for the amusement of the masses. Instead, they moved through the political and cultural spheres of Rome, attending festivals, banquets, and public ceremonies that celebrated their power. Their wealth and influence were built on the back of those who fought and died for the empire's entertainment, but the divide between their lives and those of the gladiators could not have been more pronounced. The emperor's palaces were adorned with marble, gold, and luxury goods, the fruits of Roman conquest and imperialism. Their lives were defined by indulgence, political machinations, and the exercise of absolute authority, all while the gladiators they controlled and paraded in the Colosseum suffered in squalor and violence. Slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals by definition, gladiators were property owned either by wealthy patrons or, most often, by the emperor himself. Their bodies, their lives, were not their own. Even the most famous gladiators, those who gained fame in the arena and earned the adoration of the crowds, were still trapped within a system that reduced them to tools for entertainment. The emperors themselves were the ultimate symbols of power, their lives carefully curated to project authority, divine right, and the strength of the Roman Empire. From their palatial residences, they wielded power over all aspects of Roman life, including the lives of the gladiators, who fought for their entertainment. The senators and wealthy landowners of Rome engaged in the political and cultural life of the empire, attending feasts, oratory contests, and elaborate ceremonies that celebrated their social status, while the elite rose to power through inheritance, political maneuvering, or military service. Gladiators were forced into combat, a life dictated not by choice, but by circumstance. The gladiator's life was one of constant struggle, not only against their opponents, but against the oppressive reality of being forced into combat. The elite in Roman society, by contrast, enjoyed freedom, luxury, and status. The emperor, at the height of the empire, wielded absolute power. His authority was almost divine. The elite's freedom, wealth, and status stood in sharp contrast to the gladiators' brutal existence. The Colosseum, the grand amphitheater in the heart of Rome, is perhaps the most potent symbol of the gulf between the gladiators and the elite. The elite sat in the best seats, high above the fighting pits, watching the spectacle unfold below. For the gladiators, the Colosseum was a prisoner place where they were trapped in a cycle of violence, always at the mercy of the emperor, the crowd, and the political tides of the empire. The Colosseum was also used as a tool for political control. The games, with their lavish displays of military power, human endurance, and physical prowess, helped to maintain the status quo, ensuring that the elite remained in power and the gladiators remained trapped in a cycle of violence and entertainment. The contrast between the lives of gladiators and the elite was one of stark inequality, a divide that was both cultural and political, embodied in the Colosseum and the games themselves. The gladiatorial games were not just entertainment, they were a tool of political power, used by the emperor to reinforce the dominance of the ruling class and distract the people from their struggles. Emperors understood that the gladiatorial games were far more than just a form of public entertainment. They were a powerful instrument of political manipulation. In a society where public opinion was critical to maintaining power, the games served as a tool for emperors to secure the loyalty of the masses and reinforce their control over the empire. By sponsoring grand and lavish games, the emperor could present himself as a figure of generosity, providing the people with an opportunity to escape their daily struggles, while simultaneously positioning himself as the supreme authority, capable of providing both entertainment and order. One of the central purposes of the gladiatorial games was to distract the Roman populace from the harsh realities of their lives. They also served to reinforce the emperor's absolute authority over the empire. Gladiators, despite their fame and courage, were ultimately tools in the emperor's political theater. If the people were pleased with the spectacle, their loyalty was secured. Gladiators, in this context, became symbols of the emperor's strength, fighting on his behalf to maintain Roman ideals of resilience, valor, and dominance. The games were a public display of wealth and power, proof of the emperor's ability to control the vast resources of the empire. By presenting these games as gifts to the people, the emperor built an image of himself as a generous ruler, solidifying his standing and positioning himself as an indispensable leader, one who could satisfy the needs of his subjects both physically and emotionally. The gladiators' victory, their survival, or their dramatic defeat were extensions of Roman authority, showcasing the empire's unwavering power. They were a deliberate political tool, carefully crafted by emperors to secure their authority, distract the people from social unrest, and solidify their position at the top of the Roman hierarchy. By sponsoring the games, the emperor presented himself as both a provider and a figure of absolute control, using the games to pacify, manipulate, and reaffirm his dominance over the empire. Through these spectacles, emperors maintained their grip on Rome, reinforcing their authority while distracting the masses from the realities of imperial rule. The emperor, through these games, displayed his grandeur, showing the masses that he, and by extension Rome itself, was capable of both magnificent and lavish feats. The gladiators, who fought for the emperor's amusement, were symbols of imperial authority, and their fates, whether were victorious or tragic, were shaped by the emperor's will. Each game, each gladiator's fight, and each show of blood and violence was part of a larger political strategy. The emperor used the games to project his absolute power, and the bloodshed in the arena was a visual representation of that power. The grandeur of the Colosseum and the sheer scale of the games were a direct reflection of the imperial power and dominance, and the emperor's role as the ultimate arbiter of the empire's fate. The very fact that the emperor had the power to decide the fate of these fighters, whether they would live or die, was a demonstration of his control over not only the gladiators, but also the lives of every citizen within the empire, and a physical manifestation of the control the emperor held over his empire. Its vast size and impressive architecture reminded the people of the unquestionable authority of the emperor, not just in the arena, but in every aspect of Roman life. The games helped to establish the emperor's role as the central figure in Roman society, reinforcing his authority and sending a clear message to both his supporters and his enemies. Rome's power was absolute. In a society where the emperor's image needed constant reinforcement, the games became a way to give back to the public, albeit in a manner that served the emperor's political interests. By sponsoring grand spectacles, the emperor could present himself as a provider, one who could bestow greatness upon the people, offering them not only food and shelter, but also an escape into the drama of the gladiatorial arena. In an empire as vast and complex as Rome, there were always underlying issues of poverty, political instability, social unrest, and corruption, and the gladiators' fates were controlled by the emperor and his decrees. This control over life and death sent a powerful message to the people. The emperor was the supreme authority, capable of granting life or bestowing death. The games were a reflection of the emperor's power to dominate, not just on the battlefield, but in every aspect of life, including the lives of those who fought in his arena. By offering the games, the emperor could divert attention away from any simmering discontent, political challenges, or economic hardships that might otherwise incite rebellion or unrest. The gladiatorial contests, with their grandiosity and violence, kept the people engaged and distracted, and in doing so, they stabilized the political climate, ensuring that the emperor's authority remained unchallenged. For many citizens, the gladiatorial games were a brief, intoxicating escape, a way to momentarily forget the struggles of daily existence. A day at the Colosseum, watching gladiators fight to the death, was an opportunity for the people to engage in a spectacle that not only entertained, but also provided them with a cathartic release of emotion. But this distraction served a dual purpose. While the games allowed the people to escape their problems, they were also a deliberate tool of the emperor to pacify the populace. In this sense, the games acted as a kind of social opiate, dulling the awareness of the people to the inequalities and injustices in Roman society, while reinforcing the emperor's image as the benevolent and all-powerful ruler. The gladiatorial games were not simply a way for the emperor to entertain his subjects. The outcome of the games was a direct extension of the emperor's sovereign power, a dramatic performance where the crowd's desires. The emperor's ability to influence public opinion through these games was also essential in maintaining his legitimacy. The games, while violent, were also a way for the emperor to demonstrate his generosity and capacity to provide for the people. While this could be seen as a calculated act of benevolence, it also carried political weight. Moreover, the luxury of the games also showcased the emperor's wealth and the empire's capacity to organize such grand displays. In addition to being a method of pacification, the gladiatorial games were a strategic means of political control. The Colosseum, the grand amphitheater that housed these games, stood as gladiators rose to fame, admired for their strength, bravery, and valor. They were gradually co-opted as tools of imperial propaganda. The Roman emperors, keenly aware of the potential for public opinion to shape their reigns, used these gladiators, often the most famous and beloved figures in Rome, not only as symbols of personal achievement, but as living representations of the virtues that defined Roman identity. The gladiators' victories reinforced the idea that Roman superiority was unchallenged, that the empire was not only dominant on the battlefield, but also invincible in its own capital. Each gladiator's success, celebrated by the crowd, was an indirect celebration of the emperor's power, a subtle reinforcement of the emperor's role as the commander of the Roman state. These qualities, which the emperor sought to project both publicly and politically, were reflected in the gladiators' lives, especially in the brutal world of the arena, where survival depended not just on raw strength, but on obedience and training. Gladiators, like soldiers, were required to show unwavering loyalty to the system that controlled them. Gladiators, by performing under the strict command of their patrons and the emperor, became the embodiment of a society in which individual desire or ambition was subordinated to the greater good of the state. Gladiators, by their very nature, were controlled by their masters, but their fame and adulation from the public gave them a sense of glory even if that glory was fleeting. Their success in the arena was seen as an example of Roman resilience, representing not just physical strength, but also the moral character of the empire. Gladiators, with their rough beginnings and bloody fates, were transformed into examples of what Rome represented: strength, valor, and endurance in the face of adversity. By choosing which gladiators to sponsor, promoting their success, and ultimately controlling the narrative surrounding these public figures, the emperor directly influenced how they were perceived. In this sense, the gladiators' victories were metaphors for Rome's victories. Through their fame and victories, they embodied the values that the emperor sought to project: strength, resilience, discipline, and obedience. Their public battles were not just acts of personal valor, they were extensions of the emperor's power and control. The very fame of these gladiators, carefully manipulated and leveraged by the emperor, reinforced the message that Roman dominance was both unchallenged and alive in the heart of the arena, and the crowd's adoration of these gladiators became a form of political endorsement of the emperor's reign. A successful gladiator's rise to fame was often shaped by the emperor's political needs. If a gladiator gained favor with the people, that success could easily be framed as a reflection of the emperor's wisdom and benevolence, used to reinforce Roman ideals and to project an image of Roman strength to both the people of Rome and to the larger world. Through them, the emperor could manipulate public perception, ensuring that Rome's glory and strength would continue to shine in the eyes of its people and in the eyes of the world. Their success was framed as not just personal victory, but emblematic of Roman ideals, an endorsement of Roman values that could inspire the masses to respect the system that provided such greatness. The emperor's control over life and death, demonstrated in his ability to determine the fate of the gladiators, was a direct extension of the control he exercised over Roman society as a whole. Gladiators, then, were not only fighters but embodiments of imperial power, reinforcing the emperor's image as the head of a state built on military strength, moral fortitude. Their victories in the arena were the emperor's victories. Their triumphs served as a public reminder that Rome's glory was undefeated. This idea of obedience was reinforced by the gladiators' roles in the games. They were, in essence, performers of discipline, acting as living symbols of the emperor's power to shape the fate of both individuals and the empire. Their participation in the games was, in a way, a public display of submission to that system. It reflected the idea that strength and skill alone were not enough to thrive within Roman society. Obedience and order were just as important. Gladiators, for all their prowess, were not free men. They were under the control of the emperor and the elite. Their lives were shaped by strict training regimens and an ironclad code of conduct, one that emphasized the necessity of both physical skill and mental submission. Valor, strength, and endurance were qualities that Romans held dear, and these were precisely the virtues that gladiators embodied. Through their victories and public displays of skill, they became symbols of Roman power, living, breathing extensions of the empire's might and military prowess. The gladiator's fame was often leveraged by the emperor to further his political agenda and reinforce his authority. Successful gladiators, those who had survived multiple battles and gained the love of the crowd, were more than just skilled fighters. They were icons of Roman strength, their victories interpreted as demonstrations of the empire's undefeated power. The gladiators, in essence, became the emperor's living propaganda. Their triumphs in the arena were seen not as personal conquests. Every gladiatorial victory was a small but significant victory for the emperor's image, as it allowed him to align himself with the glory, might of the gladiators, presenting himself as both the source of Rome's power and the stabilizing force behind the empire's, but as extensions of the emperor's own strength and the unassailable might of Rome. The emperor, through the sponsorship and manipulation of these gladiators, ensured that the public maintained the perception that Roman dominance was alive and well not just in the distant frontiers of the empire, but in the very heart of Rome. In this way, gladiators became performative representations of the empire's strength, tools used by the emperor to project an image of unwavering control and invincibility. In addition to their role as symbols of physical strength, gladiators also became emblems of Roman virtues like discipline and order. The very fact that gladiators were controlled, trained, and ultimately commanded by the emperor and the political elite reinforced a key aspect of Roman identity. Order and discipline were the bedrock of Roman society. This public display of submission also reinforced the idea that all citizens, regardless of their status, were ultimately subject to the empire's will. The gladiatorial games, through their brutal violence, also served to reinforce certain ideals of Roman society. Through their battles, the emperor projected an image of Roman supremacy, a model of discipline, loyalty, and strength that was essential to maintaining the empire's status. By positioning gladiators as living symbols of Roman virtue, the emperor sought to use them as a vehicle for his own political agenda. Through the sponsorship of gladiators, the emperor was not just supporting the games, he was actively participating in the construction of his image. For example, the emperor might use a famous gladiator to highlight Rome's imperial power, portraying the gladiator as a symbol of military dominance and the empire's superiority over its enemies. Gladiators were not just fighters in the arena, they were integral instruments of imperial propaganda. In the end, gladiators were more than just tools of entertainment, they were living symbols of imperial power. The grand gladiatorial games held in Rome were far more than just public entertainment. They were a reflection of the political realities of Roman life, and an extension of the emperor's absolute control over not just the arena but over the very lives of his subjects. These games, celebrated with extravagance and bloodshed, were calculated tools of imperial propaganda, allowing the emperor to maintain the loyalty of the people while focusing their anger and frustrations on the battles that took place in the Colosseum, rather than the injustices of the state. By offering such lavish and thrilling spectacles, the emperor ensured that the masses were kept content and distracted from the realities of Roman life: poverty, corruption, political strife, and inequality. It was designed to be impressive, evoking awe and admiration, while serving as a permanent reminder of the emperor's ability to organize and execute such grand spectacles. The architecture of the Colosseum, with its multiple levels, vast seating capacity, and advanced engineering, symbolized the vast reach of the Roman Empire and its ability to unite people from all corners of the empire in a single shared experience. The emperor, in building the Colosseum and sponsoring the games, was asserting that he could command not only the empire's resources, but also the emotions and loyalties of the Roman people. It was here that the emperor could gather the people, from the common citizen to the most elite, and demonstrate the unity of the empire through shared spectacle. This unity, forged in the arena, was a form of social cohesion, one that kept the masses engaged. The emperor understood the power of the games to manipulate public perception, keep the masses pacified, and reinforce his own dominance over both the arena and the empire. The Colosseum, as the physical embodiment of this control, stood as a symbol of imperial power, a place where the emperor's strength, authority, and unquestioned rule were displayed for all to see. By controlling the fate of gladiators, by sponsoring grand spectacles that engaged the emperor ensured that his grip on power remained unchallenged. The Colosseum was not just an arena for gladiators, it was a stage for the emperor to remind the people of his absolute control and the immense strength of Rome, and, loyal to the emperor by offering them an outlet for their frustrations, while simultaneously reaffirming the emperor's central place in Roman society. The games provided a form of catharsis for the people, an emotional release that allowed them to vent their frustrations without directing their anger toward the emperor or the political system. It was a reminder to both Romans and their enemies that the emperor had the ability to control not just the empire's military might but the public's loyalty and attention. It stood as a monument to the emperor's absolute authority over both life and death, providing a stage where Roman citizens, from every walk of life, could unite under the emperor's watchful eye. By sponsoring gladiatorial games, animal hunts, and mock naval battles, the emperor used the arena as a stage for showcasing the might of Rome, its military power. The emperor's presence in the arena, whether watching the games from a private box or taking part in the spectacle, served as a reinforcement of his position as the ultimate ruler, capable of not only commanding the lives of gladiators, but also controlling the very life and death of his people. The Colosseum was a constant reminder that the emperor ruled over all aspects of Roman life, including the entertainment and passions of the man, its ability to organize, and its unquestioned dominance over both the people and the conquered lands. Every event in the Colosseum, from the gladiators' fight for survival to the death of exotic animals, was choreographed to remind the public of the strength of their emperor and the imperial order that governed them. The gladiatorial contests, with their blood and violence, gave the masses a focus, an outlet for their discontent, while also reaffirming the emperor's dominance over them. Standing as one of the greatest engineering feats of the ancient world, the Colosseum was an awe-inspiring structure that could hold tens of thousands of spectators, all gathered to witness the emperor's vision of strength and domination. This monument to imperial might showcase the technical prowess of Roman engineering while serving as a direct symbol of the emperor's capability to command such a grand spectacle. The Colosseum became, in essence, a physical embodiment of Roman supremacy. Its architectural marvel reflected the empire's unparalleled dominance over the ancient world. Its massive size and grandeur dwarfed the earlier, humble origins of the gladiatorial games, transforming them from a mere ritual to a political stage where the emperor's message of power was reinforced with each battle fought. The emperor's ability to control the fate of the gladiators, as well as the very structure of the games, symbolized his supreme power. The games, staged with careful planning and deliberation, were not just about fighting, they were about showing who had ultimate authority. The gladiators, fighting in the name of the emperor, became representations of his power and control over not just the arena, but over the Roman people as a whole. The blood spilled on the sands of the Colosseum mirrored the political bloodshed that could arise if the emperor ever lost his grip on power. The Colosseum itself, as the central arena for these public spectacles, was more than just an entertainment venue. It was a monument to imperial might. The very construction of the Colosseum was a physical representation of the emperor's authority. The Colosseum was not only a place of entertainment, but a political tool or structure designed to unite the Roman people, distract them from their struggles, and reinforce the emperor's narrative of Roman supremacy. In many ways, the Colosseum became a physical manifestation of imperial propaganda. The sheer size and awe-inspiring design of the Colosseum were designed to reflect the grandeur and immense power of Rome itself. But, beyond its grandeur, the Colosseum also served as a powerful social tool. The Colosseum, with its engineering marvel and massive scale, was also a demonstration of imperial power in action. The gladiatorial games were more than just a form of entertainment, they were a reflection of Roman imperial control. The gladiatorial games, which began as a religious ritual intended to honor the dead, evolved into one of the most powerful tools of political control in the Roman Empire. Transformed by the elite emperors, senators, and other members of the ruling class, the games became a method for reinforcing imperial authority and maintaining social order. While gladiators fought for their lives in the arena, their struggles were symbolic of the larger power dynamics at play. Their battles were not only a fight for survival but also a reflection of the emperor's, his ability to command life and death, and his control over the people. The gladiatorial games became far more than just a form of entertainment. They were an essential part of the imperial machinery, strategically used to solidify the emperor's power and maintain his grip on a vast and diverse empire. Gladiators, despite their fame and glory, were ultimately tools in a system that manipulated their lives for political and social purposes. They were, at their core, a mechanism for the elite to cement their power, keep the masses in check, and remind the Roman citizens of their subjugation under the emperor's absolute authority. The lives of gladiators, marked by both public adoration and private suffering, became part of the system that kept the empire running. And in the shadow of the Colosseum, the power of the emperor unchecked and monumenta was made clear to all who watched. Their fame could be leveraged by the emperor to project Roman ideals of strength, discipline, and order. But their fate was ultimately dictated by the political needs of the empire. Even when they rose to prominence, gladiators were never truly free. They remained subject to the whims of their masters and the broader political forces that controlled them. The Colosseum, standing as the grand centerpiece of these spectacles, was not just an arena for public entertainment, but a monument to the power and control the emperor wielded over both the arena and the people. The structure itself, monumental in scale and grandeur, symbolized the imperial reach of Rome and its ability to unite the empire's subjects under the emperor's influence. It was in the Colosseum that the emperor could demonstrate his power over life and death. offering both spectacle and propaganda to distract, pacify, and reinforce loyalty among the masses. Thus, the gladiatorial games, once simple rituals, became a reflection of the political realities of Roman life, where entertainment served as a vehicle for imperial control.